strange noises from the woods. To provide some context, I live on a 20-acre horse ranch in the panhandle of Florida, about a half hour from the Alabama border. 15 minutes ago, I heard the strangest animal sounds I've ever heard. It happened right outside the property, which is only 50 feet away from where I am right now. It was very, very loud, and it was a whistle. I heard it 4 times, spaced out like 50 or 30 seconds apart, and each whistle was different, no repeating tunes or notes. And it was loud enough to sound like it was echoing across the property. After the 4 whistles, it was followed up by an almost sigh sound, then nothing. So to sum it up, it sounded like someone was facing the property just outside the fence line, whistling 4 different tunes, followed by an almost frustrated sigh, then silence. What's even more strange is that it was dead quiet while this was happening. Shortly after the silence, I could hear a pack of coyotes in the distance, which happens all the time, and owls over the lake, which is also frequent. Also, to be clear, where the sound was coming from was an open field. It's just so dark outside I can't see in front of my face. The weirdest thing is that we're more likely to hear gunshots than other people out here. The closest neighbors are like a half-mile away on the other direction, and this sound from the road was from the same side of the property. The closest neighbors in that direction are even further than a half a mile. And we have 2 donkeys on that property to ward off predators, and I didn't hear either of them warning the herd or just doing anything at all, really. Which would mean that maybe it was human and I was hearing things. But, like I said, the property is fenced and gated, so I'd need to hop the fence, and whistling is a weird thing to do when you're trespassing in an area where shooting is common. Anybody have any ideas? My girlfriend said I might be haunted. I need some answers. This started out several years ago, and I lived in a roughly 70-year-old house, which isn't terribly old, but the oldest I've lived in. Within a week of moving in with my brother, we were in our separate bedrooms gaming, and something made me look over my shoulder to where I saw a quick shadow in the very dark hallway. He was walking past my door towards his room, and then the bathroom. I asked, and he never left his room. Fast forward to a few months later, I meet my girlfriend, and she starts noticing scratches all over my back mostly, but other places too. Places I can't physically reach, like in the center of my back. I chalked it up to nails or something from work, as I worked in a lot of attics. They started off spontaneously, but now several years later, it's almost like 2 or 3 times a week. I have mysterious scratches in places I can't reach. I'm not the most restful sleeper. We do have that cat that likes to sleep on me, but I'm never woken up from pain in the middle of the night. She often notices them when I'm showering or whatever. But most of the time, they're in the 3s, which I know isn't very good. Additionally, as they become more frequent, I'm experiencing more physical symptoms like severe and worsening back pain, bad leg pain, knees getting weak. I feel like I'm going to pass out occasionally and get dizzy even while I'm sitting down, and very intense headaches that last days, even up to a week. Maybe it's just my age, but coincidentally, I'm also having not so good luck. Got laid off at my job. My girlfriend's having a high-risk pregnancy. When I was in my high school, my girlfriend's parents would let me stay overnight on the weekends, so long as I slept in their RV that was parked in the back of the house. I had done it multiple times. My girlfriend would come sit outside with me for a while until she got tired, then she'd go inside and fall asleep, and I would listen to my Walkman while I tried to fall asleep myself. I remember one night I was having trouble falling asleep, which wasn't so unusual for me, but as I lay there I started to notice an unfamiliar background sound. And it's when I removed my headphone that I realized it sounded like people outside the RV were having a loud discussion, but the number of voices started to multiply and get louder and louder until it was unbearable. I searched round and round, peering out the windows, but nobody was there. I was very shaken at this point, and I decided to run into the house and sleep in the living room, try to explain myself in the morning. Problem was, every time I got about 6 feet away from the RV, there'd be a flash of white, and I would open my eyes and find myself back in the RV. Now, I was nearly having a panic attack, so I called my girlfriend on the phone so she could hear how terrified I was, so she could see me coming outside to get me. I heard the back sliding door to her house open. I I heard her walk across the deck, down the steps, across the garden stones, and finally her hands fumble on the RV door, but when it swung open and no one was there. Now I was pretty much in tears when suddenly felt the presence of something behind me. I turned around and found this massive red aura hovering there, and I was just overcome with this immense sense of death and dread. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I was being strangled. I remember feeling like this aura or energy was killing me, like absorbing my life force, if that makes any sense. I dropped to my knees and then I realized that if I didn't break free real fast, I was most certainly going to die. I don't know where I found my strength from, but I willed myself back from my feet and slammed the RV door open and bolted to where her mom, to much confusion, was. I explained everything that had happened, getting especially angry that my girlfriend never came outside like she promised. She said that we never spoke on the phone and that she had no idea what I was talking about at all. But when we compared our phones, her and her mom started talking me seriously and we began looking quite scared. The rest of the night was uneventful. Her mom let me sleep on the couch, but try as I might, I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see a small circle of intensely bright white light. Do ghosts really exist? As the night fell and the moon cast its eerie glow upon the world, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The silence that enveloped me was deafening, and I could almost feel the eyes of the unseen watching me from the shadows. As I pondered on the existence of ghosts, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I felt the presence behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. But then, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. Be careful what you wish for. Suddenly the room was filled with a dense fog and I could barely see anything in front of me. I heard a crackle that sent shivers down my spine and then I saw it. A figure materialized right in front of me, dressed in a crazy outfit with Nike shoes. But it wasn't the outfit that sent a chill down my spine, it was the face. The face was twisted in an unnatural grin and the eyes were dark and soulless. I stumbled back trying to escape, but the figure kept coming closer. It spoke, but its voice was deep and unearthly. You wanted to play with a ghost, didn't you? Well, here I am. My heart raced as I tried to run, but I couldn't move. The figure laughed as it closed in on me, its breath cold on my face. I screamed for help, but my voice was lost in the darkness. Suddenly, the figure vanished and the fog dissipated. I was alone in the dark, gasping for breath. I realized then that not all ghosts were friendly, and that sometimes it's better to leave them well enough alone. Remodeling ghost. It was supposed to be a simple home remodeling job, just a few tweaks here and there, but as the days passed, things started to get strange. I would hear odd noises at night, like something was shuffling around in the darkness. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew something was off. One morning after a long night of tossing and turning, I stumbled into the kitchen to find my husband already there, staring off into space. His eyes were wide and fearful, and I could hear the faint strains of music coming from the stereo. Suddenly we heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps pounding down the hallway with furious intensity. We both froze, our hearts pounding in our chests as we realized that something was very wrong. We slowly made our way towards the hallway door, peering around the corner, but nothing was there, no one. We searched the entire house, but there was no sign of anyone or anything out of place. But that was just the beginning. Over the following days, the strange occurrences increased in frequency and intensity. We heard the footsteps again and again, always accompanied by the overwhelming feeling of dread and unease. One night, I decided to check the security cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing these disturbances. To my horror, I saw two distinct figures moving through the house, their movements jerky and unnatural. They seemed to be gliding rather than walking, their bodies blurred and distorted. I showed my husband the footage and we both realized with a sinking feeling that what we're dealing with is something far beyond our understanding. We tried to leave the house, but the doors wouldn't budge. We were trapped, at the mercy of whatever was haunting us. Days turned into weeks and we descended into madness. The entities haunted our every waking moment. their ghostly presence driving us to the brink of insanity. We tried everything we could and everything we could think of, from calling in paranormal investigators to performing exorcisms, but nothing worked. The entity seemed to feed off of our fear and anxiety, growing stronger with each passing day. In the end, we were forced to accept our fate. We became prisoners in our own home, tormented by forces we could never hope to understand. And as the days turned into months, we knew that our lives would never be the same ever again. A shadow person seems to show my grandma, cousin, and dog's deaths. This was over 5 years ago now, but it stayed fresh in my mind since the day it happened. I live in Huntington, West Virginia, and up until this point, I hadn't had many encounters with strange things, but the things I did have encounters with have stuck with me, and this is one of them. I was out late one night around 2 a.m. walking with my dog, who was named Link. We walked around the block like normal, and we cut up the alleyway near my home. As we were walking past a motion sensor light that my neighbors had installed, it kicked on. As we got closer to my home, Link turned around and put himself between me and something. I turned around and squinted, looked down the alleyway, and I saw a man just standing there. Couldn't make out any features, and he was dark as the night around him. I yelled at him, asking if he needed something. No response. At this point, Link is in full guard mode, growling and snarling at this guy. I pulled in Link's leash and tried to force him to move, and he wouldn't budge. After a moment, the guy started coming towards us. Once again, I spoke up, telling him to back off or my dog would hurt him. He became faster, and as he neared the light of my neighbor's house, kicked on, and this guy seemed to absorb the light. No face, no hair, nothing. And as he stepped to where Link could get him, he vanished. Link turned tail and ran to our front door and went inside. I stayed up that whole night watching and listening. The next morning, I removed, waking up and going to the bathroom. While using the bathroom, I heard my grandma plan a day and used my name. I called her and asked if she was okay, and she was happy to hear from me, but assured me that she was good. About 2 months later, she passed away, congestive heart failure. The very next year, around the anniversary of her death, Link died from kidney failure. The year after, my cousin died of suicide. What makes me think of this is maybe to tell me that we're all going to pass. And it's not only I and Link that night, but when this thing disappeared, it was the right level with the garage door of my neighbor's, which is how my cousin hung himself. Energies in Chicago. As I entered the lobby of the hotel, a chill ran down my spine. The eerie silence seemed to suffocate me, and the flickering lights added to the already unsettling atmosphere. Despite the uncomfortable feeling, I forced myself to check in and head up to my room. Upon entering, the room spun before my eyes, and I struggled to keep my balance. I dismissed it as jet lag, and I tried to settle in, but the feeling persisted. It was as if the air was thick with an inexplicable energy, making it difficult to breathe. That night, I was jolted awake by a piercing scream that seemed to echo through the halls. I bolted upright, heart racing, but there was no one around. The room was empty, and the hallway was eerily quiet. I tried to shake it off and went back to sleep, but the nightmare that plagued me were beyond terrifying. The following day, I visited the Contemporary Art Museum, hoping to distract myself from the strange occurrences. As I walked through the exhibits, the same disorienting feeling returned, making me feel as though I were in a different dimension. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me, watching my every move. Returning to the hotel room that night, the feeling of unease was stronger than ever. The air was so thick with energy that it was almost suffocating. That's when I noticed the scratches on the walls, the strange symbols etched into the woodwork, and the unmistakable stench of death. As I lay in bed trying to block out the horror that surrounded me, I began to chant the Maha Mantra. But instead of bringing peace, it only seemed to anger the unseen presence lurking in the room. The chanting turned into screaming, and the walls seemed to close in on me, threatening to swallow me whole. I don't remember how I managed to escape the hotel, but I do know that I'll never forget the horror that I experienced in Chicago. I still hear the screams in my dreams, and I feel the presence of evil lurking around every corner. Some places are better left unexplored, and that hotel in Chicago was definitely one of them. Dravo Park, when you know not to return. Dravo Park is one of the many parks along the Great Miami River in our area. It used to be my favorite place because we could walk our rescue pit bull there, and it was a city park, so we were all permitted to use the boat and kayak ramps. Here are the reasons I will not be going back, nor will I pull out my kayak at that ramp. First, we took our dog to walk in the basketball field. He was being reintroduced to the new situation, people, and smells due to him being prior stressful environments that caused him to bite when he got scared. And everything scared him at the time, so limited people were best. We walked the entire tree line down to the water and then back to my car along the same tree line. Whenever I get out of my car, I always attach my keys to my belt due to my habit of just settling things down. Well, guess what? No keys on the belt. It was startling to get so dark, so my husband immediately walked to the tree line once, maybe 2-3 more times. And while he's doing that, I'm settling on the ground with the pup right in front of the car. He can't find the keys, and I'm starting to make plans for a pickup. He walks to the driver's side, opened the door, and let the dogs in. And I could see his look of confusion as he closed the door and pulls the key out of the lock. Just the car key. My keychains and other keys were gone. We looked at each other, and I'm sure the look of our faces resembled maybe the look that I had on my face. As his hands met the key, my entire spirit team is screaming, "Leave now!" But I was frozen maybe 5 or 7 seconds, and it felt like something tall was standing behind me. I got cold chills, and then I hear a whisper, "Leave." I turned to see if someone was behind me, but there wasn't anything, and my gut knew that. During this whole 30 seconds from the time he found the key to us both jumping in the car, my dog was barking and growling in the back seat. Needless to say, we got out of there fast. Here's the next story and the best part. Last March, Cincinnati had record rainfall. We decided to take my daughter to Dravo Park an hour before dusk. The temperature was 45 degrees when we start the walk down to the boat ramp. There's a hill to the left, right there, that rises up about 50 feet. And then flattens out in the woods behind there. Prior to this day, I wouldn't have known how high the hill goes up due to the tree and the large amount of tropical Ohio brush. We could see that the water had risen to the top of the hill, and back about 70 or 100 feet, we decided to go explore the top of the hill because the water had taken the brush out from the entire area. As we were walking, you could see the path that was rushing water, took and through the mud. We walked about 20 minutes in or so, and I noticed the sun's going down. My husband and daughter were in the front of me, and I say, "We're losing light, we gotta turn back now." And I pivoted on my foot and turned around, stopping, immediately gasping. There stood a man less than 10 feet from me. He was old with many wrinkles. He was tall and wearing old-style colors. His jacket was blue and his pants were blue. His hat looked like a thick bear, and strands of hair poking out all around it. He was skinny and looked emasculated and frail. He didn't move and just stood staring at me with his hands at his side. A couple seconds slowly crept by, and I hear my daughter say, "Mom, Mom." I turned to see what was wrong, and when I turned, he was gone. Apparently they had been calling my name for a better part of a minute, and I didn't hear them. So what I thought was 10 seconds was a lot longer for them. So I'm freaking out, and we immediately hike back to get back to the car. As the sky loses its last bit of light, guess what? No keys. That's when I really freaked out. There were no lights in this park at all, and the temp was dropping. There was no way we could turn around and go back into the woods to look. The car was locked, and yes, we checked the door. I called my older daughter to get a ride out of that place. Next day, my husband took his bike to went back and go look for the keys, and he found the car key. He said he walked the whole area we were and didn't see them. But as he walked back to the boat dock at the top of the hill where the concrete meets the grass, there were my keys, stuck in the ground, standing straight up in the area I never walked in. I vowed never to return, and I should have kept away, but I didn't. 2 weeks ago, we were teaching my youngest to drive in the back road. because there's a lot less traveling there. She was pretty nervous and about 20 minutes into it, and then she was done. Dravo Park was on the right, so I told her to turn right and park and switch. She starts to make the turn into the parking spot and the car lunges forward. There were woods about 8 feet from the concrete barrier at the top of the spot. I'm screaming, "Brake, brake!" And I see her leg move up and down, trying the brake with no avail. Then suddenly the car stops within an inch, to spare throwing all of us forward. Once it was in park, I turned to her and asked her what she didn't brake for, and why she was hitting the gas and pulling into a parking spot. At this time she's crying, saying that she was braking and that it weren't working. At the time I didn't believe her. Once I was home, I started to think about all the creepy things that had happened in Dravo Park, and I determined I'm never going to go back. I will never dock out my kayak there, and I'll never kayak the extra 3 miles to the next pullout. What do y'all think? Haunted park? Weird creature spotted in Minnesota. I moved to Minnesota about 6 months ago. It's a pretty cold state. More or less, I love it here. It's very peaceful, and when it snows, it's really beautiful. However, my image of Minnesota has changed as of last night. Me and my mom and my stepfather were all sitting down watching a movie in the living room. As the movie was about to end, we paused it because my mom wanted to go smoke, and I had to use the restroom. Once I'm back from using the restroom, I go and sit down with my stepdad. A few seconds later, my mom opens the patio door and yells for us to get out there. We rush outside and she tells us that she started hearing a noise of something big walking in the snow. When she started to look around for where the noise was coming from, about 40 feet away was a white trailer. She said that when she looked over there, she saw something with red eyes staring at her. She said that it looked like a really big dog. At first, my stepdad said that it was probably a coyote. Then I started to think of how my mom heard a coyote walking in the snow 40 or 50 feet away. I realized that it had to be something very big, and I've always been one to believe in paranormal things. My mother, not so much. We looked around a bit longer, and then we go back inside. A few hours later, I leave my room to go grab a soda so I can continue playing Halo. After the whole event, I've had this unshakable feeling, so I decided to just look outside and reassure myself that she was seeing things. As my eyes scan the edge of the woods, I don't really see anything, so I take a deep breath and I grab the soda and close the fridge. As I close the door, I glimpse out the window and freeze. Sure enough, I see a pair of red eyes peering at me through the trees. I couldn't see much because of how dark it was. It was around 3 a.m., but I know what I saw. I saw something that I've never seen before. Those red eyes went right through me. Then as quick as I'd seen them, they disappeared. What did I see? Something screamed at me. The night had been peaceful, or so I thought, as I laid on my left side facing the door, my daughter's voice screaming in my face, jolting me awake and scaring my daughter, who was sleeping on my other side. My heart raced as I tried to calm her down, but my own fear was too great. As I tried to go back to sleep, my arm suddenly got pulled off of the bed as if something had grabbed it. I immediately flipped on the light, and there was nothing there. I knew then that there was something in the room with us. The next night, my daughter and I decided to leave the light on while we slept. As I was about to drift off, a man's voice whispered in my ear, "Cut the light off." My heart raced as I stood up in bed, knowing that something was watching us. An hour later, the same man's voice whispered again, "The light. Cut it off." I couldn't take it anymore, and I stayed awake the rest of the night, terrified of what might happen next. The next day, I was getting a soda from the kitchen when the chandelier suddenly swung and hit me in the head. I stepped away just as it fell, hanging by the wiring. The chandelier had never fallen in the almost 9 years we'd lived in that house. As I looked up at it, I heard a woman's voice laughing. I knew then that something was in the house with us, and it wasn't friendly. I tried to tell whatever it was that it had to leave, but that it didn't have my permission to be there, but it didn't work anymore. I blessed the house weekly, but it seemed to have no effect. As the days went on, the presence in the house grew stronger. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and I could hear footsteps when no one was there. I knew then that we were also, yet again, not alone. One night as I tried to sleep, the room suddenly filled with a cold mist. I could barely see anything in front of me, but I knew that there was something there. I heard a voice, deep and menacing. "You cannot banish me, I will never leave." I screamed for help, but no one came. The presence in the room grew stronger, and I knew that it was getting closer. I closed my eyes and I prayed for protection, but I knew that it was too late. The next morning, I woke up alone in the room. The cold mist was gone, but I knew that the presence was still there. I knew that I had to do something, or else it would never leave. I reached out to a priest, but my mother refused to let him come to the house, so I did the only thing I could do. I gathered my strength and faced the presence head on. With every ounce of my being, I commanded it to leave and never return. The room shook as the presence fought back, but I refused to give up. Finally, with the burst of energy, the presence was gone. I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted but relieved. I knew that the battle had been won, but I also knew that the war was far from over. The presence was gone, but I could feel it lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. Something takes over, but what? It all started innocently enough. I'd feel this strange sensation inside of me, like something was trying to claw its way out from deep within my soul. It was unsettling, but at first I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a passing phase. But the episodes became more frequent and more intense. I'd black out for hours at a time, wake up to find myself in strange places with no memory of how I got there. And then there were voices, whispers in the back of my mind that seemed to urge me towards something dark and sinister. My daughter noticed the changes in me first. She said that my voice would change, becoming deep and gravelly, like something out of a horror movie. Then there were the blackouts. She said that everything around me would get darker, like a shadow was slowly creeping across the room, snuffing out all the light and happiness in its path. I tried to brush it off, thinking that this was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. I would wake up with scratches and bruises on my body, with no recollection of how it got there. It wasn't until my daughter started to become frightened of me that I knew something was seriously wrong. She said that whatever took over me during these blackouts was terrifying, but she didn't think I would ever hurt her. I sought out help of doctors and psychiatrists, but they all told me the same thing, that there was nothing physically wrong with me, and that my blackouts were likely caused by some form of psychological trauma. But that didn't explain the whispers or the deep ominous voice that seemed to be lurking just beneath the surface of my consciousness. I was beginning to fear that I was losing my mind. One night during a particularly intense episode, I felt something inside me snap. It was like a dam bursting open, and all the dark, twisted energy that had been building up inside me was just suddenly unleashed. I remember very little of what happened next, but when I came to, I was surrounded by carnage. My daughter was cowering in the corner, her eyes wide with fear as she looked at me like I was a monster. I knew then that I had to get help, before it was too late. But I also knew that there was something inside of me that was beyond my control, something dark and malevolent that was slowly taking over my mind and my body. As I sit here now writing these words, I can feel it stirring within me, like a sleeping giant slowly waking from its slumber, and I know that sooner or later it will take over again, and there will be nothing I can do to stop it. Something just knocked on my bedroom window. It was a cold winter night and the holiday season was in full swing. The house was decorated with Christmas lights and the smell of fresh-baked cookies filled the air. The family had just retired to their beds, ready to call it a night, when something strange happened. As the young girl sat in her bed scrolling through recipes for Christmas cookies, she heard a sudden knocking sound. 3 loud and rapid knocks on her bedroom window shattered the silence of the night. She was instantly filled with terror and called out to her father. Her father rushed to her room, and she told him what had happened. He ran outside to check for any signs of an intruder, but to his surprise, there was no one there. He returned to the room and reassured her that everything was okay. However, as soon as he left the room, the girl noticed a shadow lurking behind the curtains. It was as if someone was standing outside of her window, watching her. She immediately called out to her father, and he rushed back to the room. He looked outside the window but found no one there. The girl was trembling with fear, and her father tried his best to console her. He He urged her to go to sleep, promising that everything was fine, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still watching her. Suddenly, their dog started barking furiously, and the girl's fear intensified. She had never seen the dogs behave like this before. It was as if they sensed something sinister lurking outside the house. As the night progressed, the knocking on the window grew louder and more persistent. The girl's father tried to calm her down, but the sound of the knocking echoed in her ears, and she couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Hours went by and the family waited for the night to pass, but the knocking on the window continued. The girl tried to close her eyes and force herself to sleep, but every time she did, the image of the shadowy figure behind the curtain would flood her mind, and she would jolt herself awake, paralyzed with fear. The night was long and grueling, and the girl couldn't wait for it to be over, and the first rays of sunlight crept through the window. The knocking finally stopped, and the girl felt a sense of relief wash over her. The family breathed a collective sigh of relief, glad that the night of terror was finally over. However, the girl couldn't shake off the feeling that something dark and malevolent was still lurking around, waiting to strike again. But she knew that she would never forget that terrifying night and the fear that consumed her. From that night on, she always slept with one eye open, knowing that the darkness held many secrets, some of which were best left undiscovered. This just happened and I'm creeped out. It was a typical evening and I'm going about my business in the back of the house, and suddenly I hear a sound that made my blood run cold, the front door opening. I froze in my tracks trying to process what I just heard. I knew that I was home alone, so the sound of the front door opening had to mean that someone was in the house with me. I slowly made my way down the hall, trying to keep as quiet as possible. As I approached the living room, I saw that the front door was standing open, swaying gently in the breeze. At first, I thought that my mother must have come home from work early and was just in her room, which was near the front door, but as I called out to her, there was no answer. That's when things started to turn for the worse. The door suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang, as if someone had pushed it from the other side. I stood there frozen in shock and terror, trying to process what had just happened. There was no one in the house with me, and yet the door just closed on its own, as if some unseen force was at work. My mind raced with all sorts of possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it a burglar? A ghost? A demon? I frantically searched the house, but there was no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. It was as if the door had closed all on its own with no explanation. For days afterwards, I was plagued by nightmares and a sense of deep unease. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump out of my skin, convinced that something was lurking just beyond my field of vision. Even now, as I sit writing these words, I can't shake the feeling that something malevolent is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I fear that it always will. Put dishes away clean and they keep coming out dirty again. I've been living in an apartment for a few months now, and I always put away clean, dry dishes. A few times, I've noticed a few small brown stains on the dishes after I take them out, like someone had spilled some coffee and let it dry. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe missed a spot, until one day the whole stack of plates had the same small, dry brown spot on them. I washed every single one, wiped the cabinet, put them all away. I forgot about this until tonight, when I took out the gravy boat I had just used, washed, and put away a couple of weeks ago. It was completely dirty in the same way, but couldn't be explained away by anything. There's no evidence of any leaks coming from above the cabinet, and this has happened in the bottom shelf. I've tried Googling and saw nothing, but I thought I heard something paranormal that had to do with dishes getting magically dirty in the cupboards. Any input is appreciated. Don't roast me for not doing this before. This is just short-term rental and we're moving out soon. We had a roof leak in the kitchen one time when there was a really heavy rain, but the drips were nowhere near the cabinet. There are angled, exposed beams that angle down toward the cupboard, which I never thought about until now. My boyfriend got up to the counter to look in the gap above the cabinet, and we were so grossed out. I guess the leaks happen more often, but didn't dip in a way that we noticed. The water likely ran down the angled beams, down the wall, and onto the top of the old cabinet. I guess through the seams the water trickled down and got onto the dishes. However, not before soaking through a nasty oven mitt, sometimes wedged, and got the gap maybe to soak up the leaks. This honestly barely surprised me because this place is incredibly run down. Light comes through from outside through the cracks in the walls, and you can get splinters from the DIY hardwood floors. We just had no other options until next week. I knew it could have been maybe pest-based on the way the stains looked. I'm quite underwhelmed with the outcome of this mystery, but it also disgusted and somewhat looking forward to moving out. Chills down my spine. As an undergrad student at the College of Staten Island, I knew the history of the campus. There had been whispers of strange occurrences and unexplainable events, but I never truly believed them until what happened to me the other day. I was in the library on the 3rd floor, trying to study for my upcoming exams. It was getting late and there were fewer students around me. I had my AirPods on and noise cancellation on, but no music playing, when I suddenly heard the most blood-curdling scream. It was so loud and intense that it felt like it was right next to me. At first I thought someone was being murdered or hurt. I felt chills run down my spine and quickly got up from my desk and looked around, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The scream had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. I quickly ran down to the 1st floor to tell the librarian what had happened, but when I told her, she seemed skeptical and didn't believe me. She went and asked another librarian if she had heard anything, but she said no also. We both went back up to the 3rd floor and we walked around. We saw a group of girls huddled together looking frightened. We approached them and asked if they had heard the scream. They said yes and had gone to look around, but they hadn't found anything or anyone. I felt relieved that I wasn't the only one who heard the scream, but it was also sending shivers down my spine. As we left the library, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something just wasn't right. I had heard stories of strange occurrences happening at the campus, but I never believed them until that day. The scream felt like it came from beyond this world, and made me wonder if there were any similar stories. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the scream echoing in my head, and I was afraid that something was watching me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was something evil lurking on the campus, and it was coming for me. The next day I was asked around to see if anyone else heard the scream, but most people seemed reluctant to talk about it. The few who did speak about it had similar stories of unexplainable events happening on the campus. It made me realize that there was something sinister about this place. As the days passed, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me still, and the scream kept echoing in my head. I began to see shadows moving in the corners of my eye, and I could hear whispers when no one was around. I knew then that I had to get the hell out of that campus before whatever was haunting me consumed me entirely. The thought of going back there still sends shivers down my spine, and I can't help but wonder if the scream was a warning or something far more terrifying yet to come. Story of my life. The memories of strange occurrences still haunt me to this day. It seems as though I'm always the one to experience the unexplainable. It's almost as if I'm a magnet for the paranormal, but the events that occurred a year ago still sends chills down my spine. I was sitting in the living room with my family, enjoying a relaxing evening together, and suddenly out of nowhere I was hit in the head with a ball of paper towel. My mother and I looked around searching for an explanation, but there was none to be found. It was as if the ball had appeared out of thin air. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to throw the ball in front of me to see what would happen. To my shock, a few minutes later I was hit again. It was as if someone or something was playing a game of catch with me. My family and I searched the room, but no one was there. We were all alone, yet we were not. The attacks continued until I decided to put the ball on a high shelf and leave it there. It was the only way to make it stop, but even after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down so we could strike again. I eventually moved out, hoping to escape the strange occurrences that seemed to follow me wherever I went. For a while, things were good, but I can never forget that feeling of being watched or the inexplicable events that occurred that night. I fear that they will never truly leave me alone. Did I just let something sinister into my home? This morning I woke up at my usual time, 5 a.m., to go to the gym before class. I'm off campus staying with my parents, however they're away for a month, so I've had the house to myself. And while anyways, every morning I wake up, let my dog out and go do his business, shower, brush my teeth, let him back inside before I get dressed and leave. This morning I woke up a little weird. The house had a strange energy and my gut sensed that something was up. I let my dog into our pitch-black backyard. The deck light didn't turn on like it usually does, which is unusual, but I thought nothing of it and went to go take a shower. After my shower, I went back to the sliding glass door to let my dog in, and I could see him sitting there waiting for me. I opened the door and watched him, a large black lab, walk in and under the table. I then proceeded to close the door and walk to my room and get dressed. Here's where it gets weird. As I was leaving the area where the back door is, I felt the same strange feeling that I had been feeling all the morning. I decided to look at the dog's bed and noticed that he wasn't in it, so I looked back at the door and saw to my utter confusion that he was still sitting outside. My stomach instantly dropped. I could have sworn on my life that I just watched him come into my house and under the table. I walked back to the door, let my actual dog inside, and as I thought more about it, the thing I let in before looked more like a shadow rather than a dog. As she was waiting for me at the gym, she said it was probably just my imagination. But I never ever imagined something this real. I wasn't even tired. I noticed that my dog was acting a little strange too, staring at one of our walls and growling quietly. I left soon after that, and I got on with my day. I'm at a loss. If anyone has a possible explanation to ease my nerves, because I'm really dreading sleeping there alone tonight. My mother tried to possess me, but I miss her. I belong to a small town in Japan, and for many years, it's been very secluded from all the modern-day technology and professes and conservative and backwards ideologies, but my dad, who was brought up in a different area for a few years of his childhood, didn't believe in any of that. My upbringing was also modernized because of his thoughts, processes, and parenting skills. I don't remember much of my mother, as I'd lost her at a very young age of 8, due to a terrible illness which totally destroyed her skin and made her look rather unpleasant. Many doctors and shamans refused to help her as she wasn't from the town, but actually came from because of her marriage. When the word about my mom got out, many kids started teasing her and calling her names like the ugly, scary woman who lives in the brown home, the scary woman who kidnaps young girls for new skin, the witch who took my father's youth. Basically, in conclusion, my mom was really not welcome in the area and she felt like it was home. When my mother passed, my dad couldn't take it. It was just hard being a single parent, so after the mourning rituals and cremating her, we left for a new town, never to return back. But fate had some other choices. Naturally, we started adjusting to the new place and life was starting to come to a stable end, when I started having visions of my mom roaming around her grave looking for us. At first, I didn't tell my dad because I didn't want to upset him. But the vision became more and more realistic. And me imagining that my mom is unhappy with her grave place. She kept saying, "I don't like this town. The other people buried me, made fun of me. This grave is so far from you guys, I can't see you or visit you often. Shift me to a new ground. I don't like this town." Many a time it scared me so much that I couldn't sleep the whole night, and eventually I had to tell my dad. As already mentioned, my dad doesn't believe in spiritual things, and at first, he took me various psychiatrists and took me to all kinds. They all said maybe it was because of the trauma. But the vision that scared me the most was when I saw my mom trying to open the new door handle after most of the new things are blurry for me. And all I know is my dad's point of view. Apparently one day when my dad came home from work, he saw me cooking something, which was super weird because I don't cook that often. And it had a very familiar smell. I asked him to sit down for dinner, and he happily obliged. The whole time I looked rather gloomy and didn't see him in the eye. Whenever my dad tried asking me about my visions, I dodged the questions and started talking about irrelevant stuff, but my dad, being tired, didn't take much notice of it. But everything came crashing down when suddenly my dad dropped the glass of water, and the words that came out of my mouth horrified him. I said, "Honey, you are as clumsy as ever. Please take care of yourself." My dad was horrified to hear those words because I would never call my father honey, and it's something my mother would have used to call him. After that, everything was kind of hurried down. Like in conclusion, he took me back to our hometown and we did rituals. My mom's grave was changed into our new town, which was less crowded and closer to us. My dad thinks my mom was just not happy there and used that as a way to express her emotions, but I'm not really sure. Last night, after 7 years, I had a vision of my mother, and she was in the same old grave, but this time tied to her grave entrance with religious threads. She whispered with a lot of pain, "It wasn't me." And then suddenly the grave door was closed by the lady in a black dress, and she smiled at me with a rather uncomfortable, eerie air. Is it possible to hear your own ghost? Living in a new trailer park can be an exciting and thrilling experience for anyone. For me, it was a chance to start fresh and create new memories, but little did I know that the trailer I moved into held a dark and ominous secret that would soon reveal itself. As the first tenant of the trailer, I was unaware of the history of those who had lived there before me, but it wasn't until my roommate moved in that things started to take a dark turn. We would often hear strange noises and footsteps coming from different parts of the trailer, even when we were all away. It was as if someone was walking around the trailer, but we couldn't see them. At first, we thought it was just our imaginations, but we were all experienced it together, and it was just too eerie to ignore. We rarely heard each other speak, and when we did, it was just a simple hello, but it was the sounds of footsteps that chilled us to the bone. It was as if the previous tenants of the trailer were still there, walking around and haunting us with their presence. The strange occurrences continued for weeks until something even more terrifying happened. I heard my own footsteps coming from the other side of the trailer, but I knew I wasn't there. I was out running errands. It was as if my own presence had been duplicated and was now haunting me. As the days passed, the situation only grew more dire. We started to experience even more strange phenomena, including objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing by themselves, and an unexplainable feeling of dread that seemed to permeate every corner of the trailer. We began to research the history of the trailer and discovered that it had been used as a temporary morgue during a natural disaster that had occurred years before. It was then that we realized that the sounds and footsteps that we were hearing were the restless spirits of the deceased, still trapped within the confines of the trailer. We were trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. The spirits had taken up residence in our home. The trailer was no longer a sanctuary, it was a prison, a haunted house that we couldn't leave. The fear and dread consumed us, and we knew that we were in the fight of our lives. We desperately sought out help from paranormal experts, but even they were unable to rid the trailer of its ghostly inhabitants. It seemed as if the spirits were too powerful, too rooted in the trailer's history to be removed. Years have passed and the trailer still stands, a haunted relic of the past that no one dares to enter. The spirits that haunt it still roam the halls, their presence felt by anyone who dares to come near. The trailer is a dark reminder that some things are best left untouched, and that there are some secrets that are often better off hidden. That time I woke up to an alien-like entity. Back to us, it was a night back when I was about 8 years old. I had a very lucid dream that night. So lucid that I was still remembering the dream. I had a pretty simple plot. You can skip this part. In the dream, I was living it up with my dad in a house with no windows, pretty dark, and all painted orange. And in the dream, I was trying to sleep, but I couldn't. So I went to tell my dad that I was in the kitchen reading a journal. Then my point of view shifted from mine to my father's, and I started seeing what he was reading. And as soon as I put my eyes on the journal, I saw a skeleton skull that was laughing at me. I immediately woke up. Little do I know, I was waking up into the worst nightmare. And why? Because this time it was real. My bedroom was simple. My bed was located in the front of the bedroom door. When I woke up, I could see the door, and it was usually closed. And at the time, I usually slept with a little bit of a light on to put on the nightstand. Back to us. I woke up and out of the corner of my eye saw an entity standing in front of my nightstand. Initially, I didn't give it any attention, but after I rubbed my eyes, I saw that this thing was real and was not just a shadow or my imagination. I started freaking out, and as any child would have done, I started giving myself pinches trying to wake myself up, but nothing. I was definitely awake, and at this point I started looking at it, and I could clearly see a gray alien-shaped face, and after years I came to this conclusion. It was more like 5'3", and it didn't have any clothes on. It had an elongated skull, and it had its back to me as if it was looking at something over my nightstand. And then it has a huge particular head. I remember this for later. At that point, my mind had two choices: screaming at the top of my lungs to take my parents' attention and ask for their help, but I wasn't sure if they would wake up or not. I could look the other way and go back to sleep and stay awake until my mom would have opened the bedroom door to wake me up, with the fucking alien in my room. I felt threatened. That was a live or die decision to me. What would have you done? After a lot of time, I came up with my decision, screaming for help. I screamed as loud as I could, and I got the attention of both my mother and this alien figure, which, from having its back at me, rotated a little bit, showing off a large black eye, like a proper gray, and started staring at me, motionless. We stared at each other with what seemed like an eternity until my mother opened up the bedroom door, put the main light on, and in that exact moment, I saw that figure disappear into thin air. That night I slept with my parents, telling me it was just a lucid dream. After that, more than 10 years later, my dad reminded me of this episode, which my brain completely erased from the back of my mind, and proceeded to tell me that the following day, while I was not at home, he came into my bedroom, started looking around, and realized on top of my nightstand there were some Star Wars Legos such as spaceships and a Lego shuttle, everything related to space. I still have goosebumps thinking about that terrible night, and now I'm happy I can share some of it with you. Cheeky ghosts? My husband and I have lived together for around 9 years now. We've lived in 5 different houses in 3 different states. We didn't experience anything paranormal together until we moved into our last house. It was a home built in 1915 in New England. It was quiet for a couple of months, and then we started to get a lot of activity. It wasn't really scary, just more mischievous. Our next-door neighbor at the time lived in a house that used to be a man cave garage from our house. He said that he had spookier stuff happen, aggressive knocking and voices and slamming doors. Our spirit mainly liked to steal tons of stuff, but my favorite experience was when we were cleaning before my in-laws arrived. There was a balloon that got trapped up in our high ceiling for many months. We had never seen it move and had no idea how to get it down. We jokingly yelled out, "Spirit, could you help us get that balloon down?" We laughed, and then in seconds, we watched it scoot across the ceiling all the way to the stairs before we could get it. There was no moving air or wind. It was crazy to watch. We had a bunch of funny little things like that happen. Fast forward to our current house. The home was built in the 60s. We didn't have any paranormal experiences until this November, and now it's a daily thing. At 11 p.m., 3 a.m., 5 a.m., we clearly hear something walking around our hallway outside our bedroom door. Sometimes it messes with the closet door and our bedroom door. It'll quietly close them if we leave them open, for example. Lately, though, it's been touching us. It will lightly tug at my clothes during the day if I'm alone, and then my husband told me today it felt like somebody grabbed his butt. He thought it was me, and I was shocked that it wasn't me behind him. He's mostly a skeptic about this stuff, but he's definitely been shocked by our experiences in the last couple of years. Step into the realm of the unknown with us, here at Paranormal M. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our latest mysterious tales. We hope you have a spine-chillingly good time listening. The Haunting of Rosewood Mansion. Rosewood Mansion has always been a sight to behold. The sprawling Victorian mansion nestled in the hills of Virginia was surrounded by acres of lush gardens, towering oak trees, and a serene lake. It's always been a family home for generations, passed down from one wealthy family to another. But despite its grandeur and beauty, Rosewood Mansion had a dark and twisted history. The original owner, a wealthy plantation owner named Nathaniel Rosewood, had built the mansion in the mid-1800s. He was known for his cruelty to his slaves, and it was rumored that he built secret tunnels beneath the mansion, where he would keep his slaves imprisoned. As the years passed, the mansion changed hands, but the rumors of its dark past never faded. Strange things began to happen within its walls, and soon it became known as one of the most haunted houses in the region. In 1998, the mansion was purchased by a wealthy businessman named Jonathan Taylor. He was enchanted by the mansion's beauty and history, planned to turn it into a luxurious hotel. But as renovations began, the workers began to experience strange occurrences. One worker reported hearing the sounds of chains clanking in the basement, while another reported seeing a ghostly figure standing in the corner of one of the rooms. Despite this, Jonathan Taylor remained determined to turn the mansion into a success. In 1999, the mansion opened its doors to the public. The grand ballroom was adorned with crystal chandeliers and the walls were covered in ornate wallpaper. Guests from all over the world flocked to the Rosewood Mansion to experience its grandeur and luxury. But it wasn't long before the guests began to experience strange happenings. Some reported hearing sounds of footsteps in the hallways, even when no one was there. Others reported seeing the ghostly figure of a woman in a flowing white dress gliding down the grand staircase. As word of the haunting spread, fewer and fewer guests were willing to stay at the Rosewood Mansion. The staff, too, began to feel uneasy. Many of them reported feeling as though they were being watched, and some reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms. Despite these occurrences, Jonathan Taylor refused to acknowledge the possibility of the mansion being haunted. He believed that the stories were simply rumors, spread by those who were jealous of his success. Overnight, as Jonathan was closing up the mansion, he heard a strange noise coming from the grand ballroom. It sounded like someone was playing the piano, but when he entered the room, he found it empty. He shrugged it off, convinced that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But as he turned to leave the room, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He turned around to see the ghostly figure of a woman in a white dress standing before him. Her eyes were dark, empty. Her skin was translucent. Jonathan tried to run, but his feet felt as though they were rooted to the ground. He felt a cold grip on his shoulder. He heard a voice whisper into his ear. "Leave this place," the voice said, "or suffer the consequences." Terrified, John fled the mansion and never returned. The next day, he put the mansion up for sale and sold it at a loss. The new owners, a family of 4, moved into it in 2001. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon strange things began to happen. Doors would slam shut on their own, and they would hear strange noises coming from within the walls. One night, the younger daughter woke up to see a ghostly figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was the same woman in the white dress that Jonathan had encountered. The family tried to ignore the strange happenings, but they became more and more frequent. They finally reached their breaking point when they found words saying, "Get out," written in blood on the walls of the master bedroom. Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. As a young girl growing up in West Virginia, Abby had heard stories about the Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It was a place where they sent crazy people, the ones who were far beyond help. The stories were always told with a mix of horror and excitement, and Abby had always been intrigued by the idea of exploring the old asylum. When she grew up and moved away to college, she never forgot about the old building. Years later, Abby found herself living in the same state where the asylum was located. She knew she had to see it for herself. So one weekend, she gathered some friends and made the journey to the old building. The place had been turned into a museum, and they were able to take a guided tour of the whole building. As they walked through the halls, Abby couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It was almost as if she could see and sense the ghosts, and that they were still lingering in the air. After the tour, Abby and her friends decided to sign up for a ghost hunting event. They were given a small group of people and sent to explore one of the more notorious areas of the asylum. Abby had never been more excited. They started their investigation in a room where a murder had taken place. They turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, Abby felt a cold breeze brush across her face. She shivered and pulled her coat tight around her. Suddenly, one of her friends let out a loud scream. Abby could hear her friends scrambling around in the dark, trying to find each other. When the lights were turned back on, Abby's friend was pale and shaking. She claimed that something had grabbed her arm and wouldn't let go. The rest of the group didn't see anything, but Abby believed her friend. She had felt the cold breeze after all. As the night went on, Abby and her friends explored other parts of the asylum. They heard strange noises and felt cold spots. Abby even claimed to see a ghostly figure walking down the hall. Eventually, the night came to an end, and they were sent back out into the real world. Abby couldn't stop thinking about the experiences that she had that night. She went back to the asylum several more times, always hoping to catch another glimpse of the paranormal. Years later, Abby found herself working as a tour guide at the Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. She regaled visitors with stories of the building's dark past, always trying to give them a taste of the fear and excitement that she had felt all those years ago. But as time went on, Abby started to feel a sense of the burnout. She had seen so much, experienced so many things, but that was all starting to take a toll on her. She knew it was time to step up and away from the asylum and let someone else take over. Abby retired from her position as a guide and a ghost hunter event manager in 2021, but even though she's no longer working at the asylum, she still can't shake the feeling that the paranormal things that she experienced were very real. She knows that there are certain phenomena that can't be explained by science or rational thought, and even though it scares her, she still feels drawn to the old building and the ghosts that still haunt it. The old asylum's secret. The town had always been fascinated by the abandoned asylum, which sat on a high hill overlooking the town. They had heard rumors of strange happenings, ghost sightings, and unexplained events taking place inside its walls. Some said that the building was cursed and that anyone who entered would never leave. Despite the rumors, people continued to explore the building, hoping to uncover its secrets. One such person was a young woman named Lily. She had been interested in the building since she was a child and had always dreamed of exploring its halls. One day, Lily managed to get permission to visit the building. She was thrilled at the opportunity to set off early in the morning to explore. The building was even more eerie than she had imagined. She felt a chill run down her spine as she entered. The building was dark and musty, and Lily could feel the weight of its history all around her. She wandered through the halls, searching for anything that might give her a clue about the building's past. As she moved deeper into the building, the air grew colder, began to hear strange noises. She turned a corner and saw a shadow figure moving along the wall. She froze in terror, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the shadow took on a more distinct shape. She realized that it was a person. The figure beckoned to her, and she felt an overwhelming urge to follow. She trailed the figure through the winding corridors of the building, feeling more and more lost as she went. Finally, they came to a door at the end of the long hallway. The figure pointed to the door, and Lily slowly pushed it open. Inside, she found a room that looked as though it had been frozen in time. There were old books, papers, and instruments scattered all around the room. In the center of the room was an old desk, and on it sat an old diary. Lily felt drawn to the diary and began to read. As she read, she realized that the diary belonged to a patient who had been admitted to the asylum in the late 1800s. The patient had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had been subjected to cruel treatments and experiments. Lily felt her heart break as she read about the patient's suffering. She wondered how many other patients had been treated the same way and how much they had never left. As she closed the diary, she heard a voice behind her. She turned around to see the figure that had led her into the room. The figure spoke to her, telling her that there was more to the building than she could ever imagine. Lily left the asylum that day feeling haunted by what she had seen and what she read. She knew that the secrets of the building would stay with her forever, and and she wondered how many others had been drawn into the building by its mysterious past. The Haunted Apartment, a Tale of Ghostly Encounters. In the summer of 1997, I moved into a small apartment in a downtown area of a large city. It was an old building with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper, but it was cheap and close to my job. At first, everything seemed fine. I unpacked my boxes and settled in, enjoying my newfound independence. But after a few weeks, strange things started happening. And it started with little things, like doors opening and closing by themselves, and objects moving when I wasn't looking. I brushed it off like my imagination or the wind, but as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more unsettling. One night, I was getting ready for bed and I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. They were slow, but deliberate steps. They seemed to be coming closer and closer, and I froze, convinced that someone had broken into my apartment. But when I flung the door open, there was no one there. Over the next few days, I started seeing strange shadows moving across the walls. They were human-like, but distorted and elongated, like something out of a horror movie. I tried to ignore them, but they were always there, lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. One night as I was laying in bed, I felt something sit down on the edge of my mattress. I was too scared to turn over and see what it was, but I could feel the weight of pressing down on my mattress. I lay there frozen in terror until the weight lifted and the presence was gone. By this point, I was convinced that my apartment was haunted. I started doing research into the building's history, and I did discover that it had been built in the early 1900s as a hotel for travelers passing through the city. Over the years, it had been converted into apartments, but rumors persisted that the hotel's original owner had died in one of the rooms. I knew I had to do something to get rid of the ghostly presence in my apartment. I consulted with a spiritual advisor who recommended a series of rituals involving sage, salt, and prayers. I did everything she told me to do, and for a few days it seemed like the apartment was back to normal. But then things took a turn for the worse. I started hearing whispers in my ear, and I felt cold spots in various parts of the apartment. Doors would slam shut by themselves, and the shadows on the walls became more menacing. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. Finally, one night, I woke up to find the ghostly figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, thin man with a giant face and sunken eyes. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his anger and his despair radiating off of him. I knew then that I had to get out of this apartment no matter what the cost. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. I never went back to the apartment, but I did hear from a friend that the building had been condemned a few months later. The owners claimed that it was due to structural problems, but I knew better. The ghost of the haunted owner was still there, haunting the halls and scaring away anybody who dared to stay too long. In 2010, I moved into an old house in the countryside with my husband and 2 children. It was a beautiful home, but something about it always made me feel uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I always felt like we were being watched. One night a few months after we settled in, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was my husband getting up to use the bathroom, but then I realized that the footsteps were too heavy to be his. I nudged my husband awake, and we both listened as the footsteps slowly made their way down the hallway and into our bedroom. We were both paralyzed with fear, and I remember holding my breath as the footsteps stopped at the foot of our bed. I could feel something watching us, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. Eventually, the feeling passed, and we fell back asleep. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening around the house. We would hear doors opening and closing on their own, and sometimes we would find things moved from their original positions. It was unsettling, but we didn't think too much of it at first. Then one night, we were awoke by a loud crashing sound coming from the living room. We both jumped out of bed and ran to investigate, but when we got there was no one there. However, we did notice that a vase had been knocked over and shattered onto the ground. It was at this point that we decided to try and communicate with whatever was in our house. We sat down at the kitchen table and placed a candle in the center, hoping to attract the attention of any spirits that might be present. We asked questions and waited for responses, but nothing seemed to happen. However, the next morning we found the candle had been burned down to the base, and the wax had formed strange shapes and symbols that we couldn't quite decipher. We didn't know what it meant, but we both felt like it was a sign that something was with us. As time went on, we started to experience more and more of the paranormal activity in the house. We would see shadowy figures out of the corners of our eyes, and sometimes we would hear voices speaking when no one was around. Eventually, we decided that we couldn't take it anymore, and we sold the house to a young couple who were looking for a fixer-upper. We never told them about their experiences, but we couldn't help feeling guilty about passing on the haunted house to someone else. A few months later, I heard that the couple had abandoned the house, claiming that it was cursed, that the strange things kept happening to them. We never found out what happened. We both knew that the house was haunted, and that we had made the right decision to leave it behind. And to this day, I still feel like something is watching me, and I know that I'll never forget our experiences in that haunted house. Lila was at a point in her life where she felt like everything was going wrong. She lost her job, her long-term boyfriend had broken up with her, and she had been in a car accident that left her with a broken leg. She felt lost and didn't know which way to turn. One day while browsing through a thrift store, she came across an old Ouija board. She'd always been curious about them and decided to buy it. When she got home, she set up the board and started to play with it. At first, nothing happened, but after a few minutes, the planchette started to move up on its own. Lila was thrilled and asked the spirit questions about the future. The spirit told her that things would get better, but she needed to be patient and work hard. Lila became obsessed with the board and started using it every single day. She would spend hours talking to the spirits and asking for guidance. She felt like she had finally found a way to navigate through her rough times. But as time went on, Lila started to notice that things were getting worse instead of better. She was having nightmares, her relationship with friends and family were deteriorating, and she felt like something was watching her all the time. She started to wonder if the board was the cause of all of her problems. Lila tried to stop using the board, but she found that she couldn't. It was like an addiction, and she couldn't resist the urge to use it. She started to research online about how to safely use the board and found conflicting information. Some sources said it was just a game, while others warned against the dangers. She decided to reach out to a psychic who specialized in spirit communication. The psychic warned her that the Ouija boards could be dangerous and that she should be careful. The psychic advised how to cleanse her home with sage and ask for protection from her spirit guides before using the board. Lila took the advice and started to use the board more cautiously. She asked for protection from her spirit guides before each session and made sure to cleanse her home regularly. She noticed that things started to get better and she felt more in control of her life. But she also realized that the board wasn't the answer to her problems. She needed to take responsibility for her life and make positive changes. She started to focus on her passions and hobbies, and she even started her own business. Lila still has the Ouija board, but she only uses it on rare occasions. She learned that seeking guidance from spirits can be helpful, but it's not a substitute for taking action and making positive changes in your life. The Return of Max. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, and the paranormal were nothing more than fictional stories in my mind. That was until Max returned to me. Max was my dog, a golden retriever. He was my best friend for years. We had a bond that no one could understand. We'd always go around the house and he'd be wagging his tail and barking joyfully. He was my constant companion and confidant. One day Max died. He had been sick for a long time, and it was a relief to see him finally at peace. I mourned his death for weeks, missing his constant presence in my life. But then one night, Max returned to me. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a noise at the door. It was a Max bark. I could recognize it anywhere. I thought it was just my imagination, but the barking continued. I got up, opened the door, and there he was, wagging his tail and barking with joy. I was stunned. Max had died weeks ago, so how was he standing in front of me now? It was like he had never left. He followed me around the house just like always. And I knew it wasn't a dream. Max was really there. Over the next few days, Max continued to visit me. He would bark at the door, and I would visit and let him in. And we would just spend hours playing and cuddling. It was like he had never died. I tried to explain it away as a hallucination or a dream, but it was too real. And one night, Max led me outside. He took me to a spot in the yard and started digging. I watched in amazement as he dug up a bone, his favorite toy. It was buried there years ago when we were playing in the yard together. It was like he wanted to show me that he was really there, that it wasn't a figment of my imagination. But then, just suddenly as he appeared, Max was gone. I never saw him again. I searched for him, calling out his name, but he never came back. It was like he had fulfilled his purpose to show me that he was still with me in spirit. I still don't know how to explain it. Was it a dream, a hallucination, or was Max really there with me? All I know is that it gave me comfort to think that it's still watching over me, even in death. It was a quiet evening and Emma was in her parents' room with their dogs. The dogs were playfully barking and Emma was enjoying their company. Suddenly all three dogs stopped in their tracks and started intently staring at the doorway. Emma could feel her heart racing as the dogs refused to draw their attention away from the door. She could sense that something wasn't right. Emma tried to brush off the feeling of continuing to play with the dogs, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She remembered that her mom had told her that her grandparents' old room used to be haunted by a ghost. Emma had never believed in ghosts before, but she couldn't ignore the fact that her dogs were sensing something that she couldn't see. As the night went on, Emma began to hear strange noises in the room. The dogs were whimpering and growling, and Emma could hear footsteps coming from the hallway. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, but she couldn't ignore the fear that was creeping up inside of her. Suddenly the room went dark and Emma's dogs began to growl. She could feel a cold breeze brush past her, and she knew that she wasn't alone. Emma reached for her phone, but the battery was dead. She was trapped in the darkness with whatever was in the room with her. After what felt like hours, the darkness began to lift, and Emma could see a figure standing in front of her. It was her great-grandfather who had passed away many years ago. He was staring at her with a look of sorrow and regret. Emma could feel his sadness, and she knew that he was trying to tell her something. As quickly as he had appeared, the figure vanished. The room returned to normal. Emma was left in shock, unsure of what had just happened. She knew that her dogs had sensed something, and she had felt it too. Emma couldn't explain what had just occurred, but she knew that she would never forget the feeling of being watched by her great-grandfather's ghost. It was a humid summer night and Sarah was wide awake, unable to sleep. She decided to get out of bed and go to the kitchen and grab a glass of water. As she walked down the hallway towards the kitchen, she noticed a cold breeze. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just air conditioning. As she reached the kitchen, she saw a shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye. She turned to look, but nothing was there. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just maybe her seeing things. She went to grab a glass and fill it with water, and when she heard a whisper in her ear, she quickly turned around, but no one was there. Sarah began to feel uneasy, but she decided to ignore it and go back to bed. As she climbed in, she noticed her dog, Jack, was staring intently at the door. Jack was a rescue dog, and Sarah always thought that he had an unusual sensitivity to things. She shrugged it off and fell asleep. The next morning, Sarah woke up and headed to the kitchen to make breakfast. As she was cooking, she noticed a photo on the counter. It was a photo of her grandfather who had passed away a few years earlier. She picked it up and smiled, thinking of all the happy memories they shared. Suddenly, she heard the same whisper from the night before. It was soft, sort of gentle, but she couldn't make out what it was saying. She turned around, but no one was there, and her heart began to race. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. As the days went by, Sarah started to notice strange things happening in her house. Objects would move, doors would creak open, and she would hear strange noises at night. She even started to see shadowy figures more often, but they were always fleeting, disappearing as soon as she looked directly at them. One day, Sarah decided to call her best friend Lily, who was a psychic medium. She told her everything about what had been happening in her house and asked her for advice. Lily listened carefully and told her that her house was being haunted by a ghost. Sarah was skeptical at first, but Lily explained that the ghost was probably her grandfather. She said that it was common for a deceased loved one to visit their family members, especially if they were attached to a particular place or object. Lily suggested that Sarah try to communicate with the ghost, to find out what it wanted or why it was there. Sarah was nervous but decided to give it a try. She sat in her living room and tried to talk with the ghost. At first, nothing happened, but after a few minutes, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. It was her grandfather's voice, and he told her that he was happy to see her again and that he loved her. Sarah was overwhelmed with emotion and tears started to stream down her face. She thanked her grandfather for visiting her and promised to always remember him. After that day, Sarah felt a sense of peace in her house. The strange occurrences stopped, and she no longer felt scared or uneasy. She knew that her grandfather was watching over her, and she felt grateful that she had the opportunity to communicate with him. In the end, Sarah realized that sometimes, even in death, our loved ones never truly leave us. They may visit us in ways we can't explain or understand, but their presence is always felt, and sometimes all we need to do is open our hearts and minds to the unknown, to connect with them once again. The incident with the door handle turning on its own had shaken me to the core. I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more sinister lurking in the shadows of my apartment building. I tried to brush it off as a freak occurrence, but deep down I knew there was something not quite right about the building. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen with increasing frequency. I would hear footsteps outside my door late at night, but when I checked, there was never anything there. Objects would move inexplicably, and sometimes I would catch a glimpse of some strange shapes or shadows out of the corner of my eye. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, but the unease that had settled in my chest wouldn't go away. It was as though something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down so that it could pounce. One night I decided to do some investigating. I waited until midnight, when I knew that most people would be asleep, and then I crept out of my apartment and into the stairwell. It was eerily quiet, and the only sound was my own breathing and the soft click of my footsteps against the concrete. I made my way up to the 4th floor, where I knew there was a storage room that was rarely used. As I approached the door, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I was taking a risk, but I had to know what was going on here. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. It was pitch black, and for a moment I couldn't see anything. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something move in the corner of the room. I froze, unsure of what to do next. It was as though something was watching me, sizing me up, trying to decide whether or not I was a threat. My mind raced with possibilities, and I wondered if I had made a mistake by coming here alone. Then suddenly there was a flash of movement, and I felt something brush past me. I suddenly stumbled backwards, tripping over a pile of boxes, and I fell to the ground. When I looked up, I saw a figure standing in front of me. It was tall and thin, with long arms and legs that seemed to stretch on forever. Its face was twisted into a grotesque mask with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. I screamed, scrambling backwards as fast as I could. The figure advanced towards me. Its long limbs reached out to grab me. I knew that I had to get away, or else I'd be trapped forever in this particular nightmare. I scrambled in my feet and ran toward the door, praying that it would open. To my relief, it did, and as I burst through into the stairwell, grasping my breath, I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, and even then, I locked the door behind me, huddled in the corner, trembling in fear. I knew that I'd seen something that night, something that was not of this world, and I didn't know what to do. The next day, I called in sick to work, and I spent a day researching paranormal activity in the area. I found a website that listed all the reported hauntings in the city, and as I scrolled through the list, I felt a chill run down my spine. There on the list was my apartment. It was said to be haunted by a ghost of a man who died in a freak accident on the 4th floor. His spirit was said to roam the building searching for something that he had lost in life. As I read through the accounts of other residents who had experienced strange phenomena, I felt a sense of validation. Finally, I had proof that I wasn't just imagining things. There was something truly eerie about this building, and I wasn't the only one who noticed it. But at the time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. If the building was truly haunted, what was I supposed to do? I couldn't just move out. I had signed a lease for a year, and breaking it would mean paying a hefty fee. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I began researching ways to cleanse the haunted space, and came across a number of different methods. Burning sage, sprinkling salt, reciting prayers, and more. I wasn't sure which method was the best, but I knew that I had to try something. So that night, armed with a bundle of sage and a bottle of holy water I borrowed from a friend, I set out to cleanse my apartment. I started with the living room, moving clockwise around the room and wafting the smoke from the sage around the edges of the walls. I recited a prayer under my breath, asking for protection and guidance. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, as though I was doing something important and powerful. When I finished with the living room, I moved on to the kitchen, then the bedroom, and finally the bathroom. By the time I was done, it was well past midnight, and I was exhausted, but I felt a sense of accomplishment. For the first time in weeks, I felt as though I had control over the situation. Over the next few days, things seemed to calm down. I didn't hear any more strange noises or see any more shadows out of the corners of my eye. I began to wonder if I had truly banished the ghost from my apartment. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. I froze. When I turned to look, I saw a figure standing outside, staring in at me with glowing red eyes. I knew then that I had been foolish to think that I could banish this ghost so easily. It was still here, still watching me, still waiting for me to let my guard down, and I knew that I had to be ready in case it decided to strike again. The apartment building had always given me a strange feeling. It wasn't necessarily creepy or ominous, but there was just something about the atmosphere that made me feel uneasy. Despite this, I lived there for a few years without any significant occurrences until that fateful morning. I'd been eagerly awaiting a package from Canada Post, and it had finally arrived. I woke up early to go check if it had been delivered yet, making my way to the third-floor door that led to the stairwell. As I reached the round metal doorknob, I felt it turn on its own. At first, I assumed someone was on the other side of the door, about to walk through it. I waited patiently, but the door kept turning, and no one appeared. It did a complete 360. Then it stopped, as if someone had changed their mind about entering. I stood there puzzled and confused, listening for any sounds or movement, but the stairwell was silent. The only thing I could hear were my own heartbeat. I knew that no one could have entered or exited the stairwell without me seeing or hearing them, but I had no explanation for what had just happened. Finally, I gathered my courage and pushed the door open. The stairwell was empty. There was no one in sight. So I walked down the stairs, checking each door that passed. They were all closed and locked. As I made my way to the lobby, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my gut. There was something not quite right about what had just happened, and I knew that I wasn't able to shake the experience off so easily. Over the next few days, strange things started to occur in my apartment. At first, they were minor occurrences like objects moving or strange noises coming from empty rooms. I tried to brush them off as coincidences or explain them away as the building settling, but deep down, I knew there was something more going on. Then one night, I woke up to a cold breeze blowing through my room. I sat up shivering and realized that the window was open, even though I knew that for a fact it had closed. Before I went to bed, I closed it. As I got up, I hear a faint whisper in my ear, but when I turned around, there wasn't anyone there. From that moment on, things started to escalate. I would often wake up in the middle of the night feeling as if someone was watching me. Sometimes I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth in my living room. My friends and family noticed a change in my behavior, and they would often comment on how on edge I seemed. One night as I was getting ready for bed, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, causing me to scream and jump back. But once again, no one there. and I knew that I was the only one in the apartment. I knew then that I couldn't keep living like this. I started to research the history of the building. It turned out that the apartment building had a long and sordid history, with many deaths occurring within its walls. One particular gruesome story involved a woman who had been murdered by her husband in the third-floor apartment where I was currently living. As I read through the accounts of the building's past, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I felt as if the spirits of those who had died there were still present, trapped within the walls of the building. Over the next few weeks, I tried to find a way to rid myself of the presence that had taken over my home. I even consulted with psychics and spiritual healers. It had been a few months since the passing of the narrator's grandpa, and the family was still reeling from the unexpected loss. The house felt emptier, quieter, and there was a sense of melancholy that hung in the air. However, something strange was happening outside the house. Every now and then there would be a scratching and tearing noises coming from underneath. The family had called in exterminators to investigate, but they found nothing. The narrator couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd about the noises. They were too persistent, too unexplained. Each time they heard them, they tried to shine a light outside the window to see what was causing them. But each time they saw nothing. It was as though the source of the noise was just out of reach, taunting them from the shadows. One evening, the scratching became louder and more insistent than ever before. It was as though whatever was causing the noise was trying to claw its way out from underneath the house. The narrator and their family were gathered in the living room, tense and anxious, when suddenly the noise stopped. They exchanged a confused look, cautiously made their way outside to investigate, and the night was still and quiet. The only sound was a distant hum of cars on the nearby highway. The family scanned the area with flashlights, but they saw nothing out of the ordinary. As they began to make their way back inside, a feeling of unease settled over them. It was as though they were being watched. Over the next few days, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Strange occurrences began happening around the house. Objects would move on their own. Doors would creak open in the middle of the night. The family tried to brush it off as their imagination, but deep down they knew that something wasn't right. One night, the narrator woke up to find their grandpa standing at the foot of their bed. He was just as they remembered him, kind eyes, warm smile, his favorite tweed jacket. The narrator sat up, heart racing, and tried to speak, but no words would come out. The grandpa beckoned them, and the narrator felt a sudden urge to follow. They got out of bed and followed their grandpa through the darkened house. The only sound was their footsteps on the creaky floorboards. They made their way outside, and the grandpa led them to the spot where the scratching had been coming from. There in the moonlight, the family saw a figure hunched over, digging frantically at the ground. They couldn't make out any features, but they could sense a malevolent energy emanating from it. The grandpa stepped forward, and the figure turned to face him. In the pale moonlight, they could see that it was no longer human, but something twisted and grotesque. The family watched in horror as the grandpa engaged in a fierce battle with the creature. They could hear the clash of steel against flesh, the clash of bones breaking. The grandpa fought bravely, but in the end, the creature was too powerful. The grandpa fell to the ground, and the creature vanished into the night. The family was left shaken and traumatized by the experience. They tried to explain it away as a nightmare, a hallucination, but deep down they knew the truth. Their grandpa had come back to protect them from the malevolent spirit that had been tormenting their home. From that day on, the family felt a sense of peace settle over them. The scratching and tearing noises ceased. The house felt less haunted, and they knew that their grandpa was watching over them, protecting them from the unknown forces that lurked in the darkness. It was the year 2003, and Emily was living in a trailer out in the countryside with her boyfriend and their 2 daughters. The trailer was cozy, but it was located far from civilization, and they were the only ones living in the area. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there were no streetlights to light up the dark nights. The only sources of light came from the moon and the stars, which were often obscured by clouds. One evening, shortly after time had changed to darkness, Emily walked out in the hallway to get something from the kitchen. As she walked, she caught sight of a shadowy figure in the living room. She froze in her tracks and stared back at the figure. It was tall, dark, and seemed to be staring right back at her. Emily didn't get any bad vibes, but she felt uncomfortable, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A few months after Emily first saw the Shadow Man, she and her family were awoken in the middle of the night by what sounded like a full-grown person sprinting back and forth across the room. The sound was loud and clear, and it was coming from above them. Emily and her boyfriend were paralyzed by fear in their bed, unsure of what to do. The sprinting continued for what seemed like an eternity, but when it finally stopped, there was nothing but silence. Emily's boyfriend checked the snow and the footprints. There was none. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She felt like the Shadow Man and the sprinting on the roof were connected somehow. The following night, when the Shadow Man appeared in the living room again, Emily decided to take action. She put out her energy and let the Shadow Man know that she wouldn't tolerate any more strange behavior. She told him to leave her family alone. She outlined the outside of her trailer with salt. For a year, Emily and her family continued to live in the trailer. She still felt the Shadow Man's presence, but there were no further instances of strange behavior. They eventually built a house and sold the trailer to a girl that Emily had gone to school with. 6 months after the girl moved into the trailer, it burned down. The girl claimed that she left a candle burning, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the Shadow Man had something to do with it. A few months later, the girl passed away, and the cause of her death was unknown. Despite no longer living in the trailer, Emily still felt an uneasy feeling most days. She felt like she was never alone. Even when she was home alone, she knew that the Shadow Man was still with her, watching and waiting. Years went by, and Emily moved on with her life. She got married and had more children. But she never forgot about the Shadow Man. Whenever she would pass by the trailer, she would get a chill. She would remember the strange occurrences that happened there. One day, she received a call from a friend who was driving past the old trailer. The trailer was no longer standing, and in its place was a large, beautiful tree. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, as if the Shadow Man had finally moved on. She knew that the tree represented new life, and she felt like the Shadow Man's spirit had finally been put to rest. To this day, Emily still thinks about the Shadow Man and the strange occurrence that happened in the trailer. She'll never forget the feeling of being watched, but she knows that the Shadow Man meant no harm. She's grateful for the experience because it taught her to be more aware of her surroundings and to always trust her intuition. It was a quiet night in the European-style house, and the only sound that could be heard was the soft hum of the air conditioning. The family that lived in the house had gone to bed, and the streets outside were deserted. All was peaceful until a sound interrupted the silence. It was a soft creaking, like someone walking on an old wooden board. But it wasn't coming from the family's apartment. It was coming from the apartment above. The family tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just an elderly woman who lived there shuffling around her apartment. But as the nights passed, the sounds became louder and more frequent. It wasn't just creaking anymore, it was the sound of footsteps running up and down the length of the apartment. It was loud enough to wake the family up from their sleep, and they began to worry. The family consisted of a father, a mother, and 2 sons. They were a close-knit family, and they tried to comfort each other as the strange sounds continued. They talked about it, and they tried to come up with a logical explanation. They couldn't find one. So one day, the mother decided to talk to the elderly woman who lived above them. She went to her apartment and knocked on the door. But there was no answer. She tried again the next day, and still no response. The family began to worry that something had happened to the elderly woman, and they called the police. When the police arrived, they found the elderly woman had passed away in her sleep. She had no family, and it was up to the landlord to clean out her apartment. The family was relieved that the noises would finally stop, but they didn't. If anything, they became louder and more frequent. The family tried to rationalize it, but they couldn't. They began to believe that the elderly woman was haunting them from beyond the grave. The family began to see strange things around the apartment. Objects would move on their own. Doors would open and close, and the temperature in the apartment would drop dramatically. The father tried to dismiss it as all imagination, but deep down he knew something more. So one night the father decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way up to the attic. The attic was dusty and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. The father looked around trying to find the source of the noises, but he found nothing. He turned to leave, but as he did, he felt a cold breeze brush right past him. He shivered despite the heat of the attic and hurried back down toward his family. The family tried to ignore the haunting, but it was impossible. The sounds grew louder and more frequent, and they began to fear for their own safety. They contacted a paranormal investigator, and he agreed to come and investigate the apartment. The investigator arrived and set up his equipment. He walked around the apartment asking questions and trying to make contact with the ghost. Suddenly, his equipment began to beep wildly. The investigator was excited. I think he had made contact with the ghost. The family watched in awe as the investigator spoke to the ghost, asking it questions and trying to determine why it was haunting the apartment. The ghost was reluctant to answer, but eventually it spoke. It was the elderly woman that lived in the apartment above them. She had been alone in life, and in death, she didn't want to be alone. The investigator tried to persuade the ghost to move on, but it was reluctant. It had grown attached to the family and didn't want to leave them. The investigator tried a different approach. He convinced the ghost to move on into the afterlife with the promise that the family would always remember and honor its presence. Reluctantly, the ghost agreed, and the investigator performed a ritual to help it cross over. After that night, the family no longer heard any strange noises or felt any unusual presences in the house. They knew that the ghost had finally found peace and had moved on into the afterlife. However, the investigator couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on in the house. So he continued to investigate and discovered that the ghost had been protecting the family from a malevolent spirit that had been lurking in the house. The malevolent spirit had been trying to harm the family for years, but the ghost had been keeping it at bay. Without the ghost's protection, the family would have been in grave danger. The investigator realized that the ghost had sacrificed its own chance to move on to the afterlife to protect the family. He was filled with a deep sense of gratitude and admiration for the ghost's bravery and selflessness. He made a vow to always remember the ghost's sacrifice and to help other spirits find peace and closure, and he knew that he would always carry the memory of the ghost's presence with him as a reminder of the power of love and strength in the human spirit. The house was an old 3-story Victorian style, with creaky floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and a musty smell that seemed to linger in every room. From the moment she stepped inside with her son, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She chalked it up to the age of the house, but the fact that it had been empty for so long before moving in might have been a factor too. At first, everything seemed normal. Her son, like any child, was excited to explore the new space and make it his own. But then he started complaining about a shadow man. At first, she thought it was just an overactive imagination, but as the days wore on, her son's fear grew, and so did hers. The woman started to do her own research, poring over books about ghosts and hauntings. She talked to friends who claimed to have experience with the paranormal. She even went so far as to consult with a local psychic, but no one could explain what was happening in her home. The shadow man continued to torment her son. He was always there, lurking in the darkness, whispering in his ear, trying to lead him somewhere. She tried to comfort him and make him feel safe, but the fear in his eyes was too much to bear. One night, she decided to confront the shadow man. Along with nothing but a flashlight and her courage, she tiptoed into her son's room. There in the corner was the shadow man. It was darker than darkness itself, a black mass that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want?" The shadow man didn't answer, just hovered there, watching her with its empty eyes. The woman tried to reason with it, to plead with it, to leave her son alone, but it didn't seem to care. It was content to stay, to whisper, to scare her son, to torment them both. Desperate, she reached out to a paranormal investigator. The investigator arrived with all the gadgets and gizmos of his trade, ready to uncover the truth. He took readings, set up cameras, and interviewed the woman and her son. As it turned out, the house had a long and sordid history. It had been on a site of a murder-suicide back in the 1920s. A man had killed his wife and children and then turned the gun on himself. The Shadow Man, it seemed, was the ghost of that man. The investigator tried to persuade the ghost to move on, but it was reluctant. It had grown attached to the family and didn't want to leave them. The investigator tried a different approach. He convinced the ghost to move on into the afterlife, promising that he and his family there would be reunited with them for all eternity. To the woman's surprise, the Shadow Man vanished the next day. Her son slept soundly for the first time in months, and the house felt lighter somehow, as if weight had been lifted from it. But the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. She would hear whispers in the night and footsteps in the hallway, and see shadows moving just out of the corner of her eye. She knew that the ghost was still there, watching over them, keeping them safe, and she was okay with that. She had to accept that ghosts were a part of her life now, and that sometimes they were there to help, not just to haunt. This 26-year-old female had always been close to her grandmother, so when her grandmother's dementia began to worsen, she decided to move in with her and become her full-time caregiver. The old house where her grandmother had lived since the 60s was a beautiful old home, full of history and character. It was a 2-story house, but her grandmother's condition meant that she couldn't make it upstairs. So she slept in the upstairs bedroom. The first few nights, the old house were quite uneventful, but on the third night, I was startled awake with the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The creaky wooden floors amplified the sound, making it impossible to ignore. She got out of bed and went to investigate, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off and went back to bed, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But the next night it happened again. This time the footsteps were accompanied by the sound of running. She bolted out of bed and raced to the hallway, but once again there was no one there. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a sense of unease creeping up on her. Something was not right in that old house. As time passed, the strange occurrences continued. Things would go missing only to turn up places that she had already checked. She heard knocking on the upstairs windows even though there was no one outside. And then there was the time that she was coming into the room and she found the sink running, even though she knew she turned it off earlier. She tried to ignore these events, chalking them up to coincidences or her imagination. But then one night something happened that she couldn't ignore. She woke up to the feeling of someone playing with her feet. It was a strange sensation, as if someone was gently moving up and down the sole of her foot. She could feel it, and it didn't stop until she quickly moved her foot. She was scared, but at the same time, she felt a sense of curiosity, what was happening in this old house. She decided to start investigating. She spent hours online, reading about ghosts and hauntings. She talked to people who had experienced similar things, and finally she decided to try and communicate with the entity that seemed to be haunting the old house. She set up a camera in her room, hoping to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. She also started to keep a journal, documenting every strange occurrence that happened in the house. And then one night she decided to try and communicate with whatever was there. She sat in her room with the lights off and began to speak out loud. "If there is anyone here, please give me a sign," she said. She waited, but there was no response. She tried again. "I don't want to harm you. I just want to understand. Can you please give me a sign?" Suddenly she felt a chill run down her spine. She could sense that something was there watching her. She waited, holding her breath, and then she heard a faint whisper. It was a voice she couldn't quite make out, but it was there. She turned on the lights and looked around, but no one. As the weeks went by, she continued to document the strange occurrences in the house. She also tried to communicate with the entity, hoping to gain a better understanding of what was happening, and then one night she finally got her answer. She was in her room lying in bed when she heard a soft voice. It was her grandmother calling out her name. She got out of bed and went to her grandmother's room, but she was fast asleep. Confused, she went back to her room, only to hear her grandmother's voice again. This time she realized that it wasn't her grandmother's voice she was hearing. It was the voice of the entity that had been haunting the house. She sat down on her bed and started talking to the entity. "Who are you?" she asked. The voice responded. I am the previous owner of this house. I died here and I never left. She was shocked. She never considered the possibility that the entity haunting the house could be a former owner. She started asking more questions, and the voice continued to answer. They talked for hours until finally she had a better understanding of what was happening in the old home. After their conversation, she felt a sense of relief. She knew that the entity meant no harm, and she was simply stuck in the house, unable to move. She continued to document the strange occurrence, but she no longer felt scared or uneasy. She had finally made peace with the entity and was able to live in the old house without fear. Years later, when she moved out of the old house, she left behind her journal and the camera she had set up to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. The new owners of the house never reported any strange occurrences, but she knew that the entity was still there, watching over the house that had been its home for so many years. My first and only paranormal experience still blows my mind. As a 28-year-old adult, I still remember the story that happened when I was just 15 years old. At that time, I was a little pothead that loved smoking weed, so whatever chance I got, I was basically every day I'd get high with my friends. But that's not the point. I grew up in a town in the UK that was huge for a town, with nearly 100,000 people. Where I used to live was an estate full of houses. I had a best friend at the time who lived about 20 or 25-minute walk away from my house. But in order to get there, we had to walk through a wooded area that led to a big lake that you would walk around to get near his house. One day, randomly, I was out with my friend and many others when we noticed a lot of police presence in the area near the woods, and there was a police helicopter up in the air. Being curious, we followed the police to the woodlands that separated out our houses. We went through the woods to the lake where the police and ambulance workers were amongst many bystanders at this point. We got there and started asking people who we knew what had happened. We were told that a young boy around the age of 7 had drowned in the lake nearby, and it was right near the path where everyone was gathering. Over the next couple of days, the police were trolling the lake looking for a child who they knew was there because his friend ran out to help when he fell in and couldn't get out. 2 or 3 days later, after he slipped in, the authorities found the young boy's body, which was big news in my town. No later than 24 hours after the boy was found, the local council installed a black metal bench on the footpath near where he had died with a little plaque commemorating his life. That very next day, I was out with my friend near where I lived, and we were getting high, and a bunch of other friends that we knew were there too. By the time we were done getting high, we decided to go back to his house to sleep, because my mom would have gone crazy over the fact that we were that high. We started to walk back to his house at around 11, and it was really dark out. We passed my house and eventually got to the woods. We walked through the woods and got to the start of the lake. We started walking down the side of the lake down the path toward where the kid drowned and the bench was. We were just talking nonsense as high teens did, when I noticed that when the bench got into sight, there was a man that sat on it. Now, I was a bit freaked out, but I didn't say anything yet. It was 11 p.m. near the woods in the dark, so it was creepy. But when I got a little closer, I noticed I could see what the man was wearing, and he was dressed as a priest. You know, black jacket, white collar. Upon seeing this priest, I breathed a sigh of relief, because I was presuming that he was maybe praying or something of the sort. Maybe for the kid that had drowned. So after noticing this priest, I just watched him sit there as I got closer and closer. I didn't say anything to my friend who was right next to me, but we collectively stopped talking once we noticed him. As we got closer, it was more obvious that he was a priest, and then once we got within 5 meters, he was gone. I felt like I blinked and he just disappeared. When we were walking past the actual bench where I saw him sit, there was nobody there. But if he would have gotten up and walked away, I would have seen him because it was a one-track walkway. But he just vanished. After I got to the bench, I turned to my friend, who was just as confused and spooked as I was. I asked him if he had seen the man that sat on the bench. I didn't want to say what type of man, because the way he was dressed was very obvious as to what type of man he was. But I asked him "Did you just see that man sitting on the bench?" He said, "Yeah, the guy dressed like a priest." When I tell you my heart sunk, I can't explain that feeling or that situation. What gets me is that I purposely asked my friend that he was a man, and he corrected me by saying that the man was a priest. If it was a person, they would have just maybe got up and walked away, straight down the line in the path, which we would have seen. Or they would have just walked right past us, but no, when we got close, poof, gone. Still to this day, it's my only paranormal experience, but it blows my mind every time I think about it. I still wonder if that priest was a ghost or if he was a real person. Perhaps he was there to offer his prayers to the young boy who drowned. But why did he disappear so suddenly? Was it some kind of supernatural occurrence? Or was it just a trick of the light? If we were seeing things, maybe. These questions still plague me, and the incident left a lasting impression on me too, and I became more curious about the paranormal. I started reading books on ghosts, hauntings, and the supernatural. I even visited haunted places and went on ghost hunts with friends. But nothing ever came close to that one experience I had by the lake. Looking back on that night, I realized how easily we could have been in danger. Walking in the woods at night while under the influence of drugs was not the smartest thing to do, but we were young and foolish, and we thought nothing could harm us. Little did we know that we were about to have a brush with the unknown. In conclusion, that night by the lake remains one of the most mysterious and puzzling experiences of my life. It taught me to be more aware of my surroundings and to always keep an open mind. Who knows what other strange and unexplainable events might be lurking around the corner. My family tree. I have many stories to tell, mostly passed down from my dad. One of the earliest tales goes back to when I was only 2 years old. My dad showed me a picture of my great uncles, and as he pointed to each person, I suddenly interrupted him and pointed to the guy in the photo, exclaiming, "That's my Uncle Joe." My dad was taken back and asked how I knew him, to which I simply replied, "He comes up to my room every night to tell me jokes." My dad then informed me that Uncle Joe had actually died before I was even born. It was a spooky realization for such a young age. But that wasn't the only spooky encounter my dad has had. He used to work on an apartment house, and one day he was up on the roof talking to a neighbor when he noticed one of his tools started to smoke. Now, nothing was plugged in or even on, but all of his tools suddenly caught on fire. In a panic, my dad started to throw his tools off the roof, losing about $100,000 worth of them in just 1 minute. It was a devastating loss, but it wasn't the only strange occurrence in that apartment. There was also a ball in the kitchen that seemed to have a mind of its own. Whenever anybody walked into the kitchen, the ball would roll over into the living room. And when someone walked into the living room, the ball would roll back into the kitchen. It was as if the ball was alive and had a mischievous nature. My dad decided to throw it out the window, thinking that that was going to be the end of it. And when he turned around, the ball was right back in front of him again. He tried to get rid of it by shredding it 3 times, but the ball always seemed to find its way back to him. Finally, he was able to get rid of it for good, though. It's amazing to think that we still own that same apartment house today. Whenever I think about these stories, it sends shivers down my spine, and they're just a few examples of the strange and unexplainable things that seem to happen in this world, and I'm grateful to have them as a part of my family's history. It's been 5 days now, and I'm feeling tempted to use a Ouija board. Day 1. I woke up at 3 a.m., the first night. It's a common occurrence for me, so I didn't think much about it. I groggily glanced at the clock, rubbed my eyes, and tried to fall back asleep. Day 2. The next night was different. I woke up at 3:33 a.m., feeling disoriented, and I stared at the wall while lying on my stomach in bed. It was as if my eyes were open before I was even fully regaining consciousness. I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that something was off, but I brushed it aside and tried to go back to sleep. Day 3. The following night was when things took a strange turn. I jolted awake at 4:43 a.m., and as I turned to look at the same time, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. A folded old-time screen, the kind people used to change behind, fell in front of me. It happened just a second after I woke up, as if it had been waiting for me to open my eyes. I quickly snapped a photo, but I couldn't fathom how the screen had ended up there, and I had no idea how to attach a photo to share with anybody. Day 4. On the 4th night, I was hanging out with my roommates, trying to distract myself from the strange things the past few nights. My fan was already on, but the light was off, and suddenly the light turned on in front of us. It caught us all off guard, and we tried to rationalize it as a circuit malfunction. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Day 5, present time. Now I'm at the present moment, and events have only escalated. I was in my roommate's room trying to calm my nerves when I heard a loud crash coming from my own room. My heart raced as I rushed to investigate, and I was horrified to find out that my Ouija board had fallen off of the top shelf. The shelf is so high that I need a step stool to reach it, and there's no logical explanation for how it could have fallen on its own. The incidents were becoming too frequent and too strange to dismiss as mere coincidences. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to communicate with me, and I was getting increasingly unnerved. My mind was filled with questions and doubts, and I found myself constantly on edge, anticipating the next inexplicable event. I confided in my roommates, but they were as puzzled as I was. They tried to rationalize the occurrences, attributing them to being faulty wiring or drafts in the house. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following me wherever I went. Sleep eluded me, and I found myself dreading the nighttime, knowing that it would bring more unsettling experiences. I became obsessed with finding answers, scouring the internet for stories of similar occurrences and consulting with experts in the paranormal field. But despite my efforts, I couldn't find any plausible explanations for what was actually happening here. As the days went by, my mental state deteriorated. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little sound. I isolated myself from my roommates, afraid of whatever was haunting me would harm them too. My once peaceful home had turned into a place of unease and fear. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I took drastic measures to try to rid myself of the strange things. I performed rituals, cleansings, and even sought the help of a psychic, but nothing seemed to work. If anything, the incidents only seemed to intensify. It was as if my efforts to confront the unknown entity had only provoked it further. The lack of sleep and constant state of fear took a toll on my physical and mental health. Dark circles formed around my eyes, and my once cheerful demeanor turned into a constant state of anxiety. I was on edge, always on high alert, trying to anticipate the next inexplicable event that would shake me to my core. One particularly unsettling night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my room. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously investigated, but there was no one there. I searched every nook and cranny, but the room was empty. I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone or something had to be there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. The experience left me trembling and on edge for days, unable to find any explanation for what had happened. Desperate for answers, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. I visited the local library and uncovered some unsettling information. It turned out that the house I was living in had a dark past. It had been owned by a family that had experienced a tragic loss years ago. Rumors of paranormal activities had circulated in the town, but most people had dismissed them as urban legends. Armed with this new information, I delved further into the history of the family that had once lived in the house. I discovered that they had used a Ouija board in attempts to communicate with their deceased loved one, but had unknowingly unleashed something malevolent. The occurrences that they had been experiencing seemed to mirror their own, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that their tragic history was now repeating itself with me. With a renewed sense of purpose, I sought out the help of a paranormal investigator. They conducted an extensive investigation of the house using various tools and techniques to communicate with any potential entities. The results were chilling. A electronic voice phenomena, EVP recording captured eerie voices, and the EMF readings were off the charts in certain areas of the house. The investigator confirmed that there was indeed a presence in the house, and it seemed to be drawn to my energy. Armed with this information, I decided to confront the entity head on. I conducted my own research on how to communicate with spirits safely, and I gathered the necessary tools, including the Ouija board that had fallen off the shelf. With trepidation, I set up the board in the living room, surrounded by candles and a protective symbol. As I placed my hands on the planchette and asked questions, I felt a surge of energy in the room. The planchette moved erratically, spelling out cryptic messages that sent shivers down my spine. It seemed like the entity was desperate to communicate, but its messages were confusing and unsettling. I could feel its anger and frustration, but I couldn't decipher its true intentions. The session left me emotionally drained and more confused than ever. I couldn't make sense of the messages I had received, and I was no closer to understanding the true nature of the entity that was haunting me. The activity in the house seemed to have escalated, with objects moving on their own, disembodied voices echoing through the walls, and it had an oppressive atmosphere that hung heavy in the air. One night I woke up to find scratches on my arms, as if someone or something had clawed me while I slept. The marks were deep and painful, and I was filled with dread. I knew that I had to take drastic action to rid myself of the entity once and for all. I sought the help of a renowned psychic medium who conducted a cleansing and a blessing ritual on the house. The energy in the house shifted, and the activity seemed to subside for a while. But just when I thought I was finally rid of the entity, it returned with a vengeance. One night I woke up to the sound of whispers in my ear. I could feel icy breath against my skin, and my heart raced in fear. Turning on the lights, but there was no one. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but they followed me everywhere I went in the house. Feeling desperate and exhausted, I decided to reach out to a paranormal expert who had dealt with a similar case. The expert, a seasoned investigator with years of experience, came to my house and conducted a thorough investigation. They confirmed that the entity was indeed still present, but its energy seemed to be growing stronger. The expert explained that sometimes entities can become attached to a particular place or person, and it can be challenging to remove them. They suggested a more aggressive approach involving a cleansing ritual that would require my active participation. I agreed, willing to do whatever it took to regain control of my home and my sanity. The cleansing ritual was intense and emotionally draining. We smudged the entire house with sage, performed prayers and chants, and set up protective barriers. I could feel the entity's presence growing more agitated, but I stood my ground, determined to confront it once and for all. As the ritual reached its climax, there was a sudden surge of energy in the room. Objects flew off shelves, furniture moved on its own, and the temperature dropped drastically. The expert and I stood our ground, holding on to our faith and determination. We continued with the ritual, pouring out all the energy into cleansing the space. Finally, after what felt like hours, the activity ceased. The house was quiet and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I could feel a sense of peace and relief wash over me. The expert confirmed that the entity had been banished, and I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. In the aftermath of the ordeal, I reflected on the harrowing experiences I'd gone through. It had been a grueling journey filled with fear, uncertainty, and sleeplessness. But it had also been a profound learning experience. I had learned to confront my fears, seek help when needed, and never underestimate the powers of the paranormal. Months passed and the house remained peaceful. I had finally regained my sense of safety and security in my own home. The scratches on my arms had healed, and the dark circles under my eyes faded. I had learned to appreciate the simple joys of a good night's sleep in a peaceful home, knowing that not everyone is as fortunate as me. To this day, I'm not sure what exactly haunted me during those sleepless nights. Was it the restless spirit of the family that had once lived in the house? Or is it something more malevolent that had been drawn to my energy? I may never know for sure, but the experience has left an indelible mark on me. I no longer dismiss stories of the paranormal as mere superstitions. I've come to believe that there are forces beyond our own understanding, and that some places may hold a dark history that can linger long after the events have passed. I'm more cautious about dabbling in the unknown, and I have learned to respect the boundaries of the spirit world. As I look back on my ordeal, I'm grateful for the support I received from my friends and family and the paranormal expert who helped me through the darkest moments. It was a journey of self-discovery, resilience, and facing my deepest fears. Though the scars may remain, I have emerged stronger, wiser, and with a newfound appreciation for the unexplainable mysteries of the world. My possibly haunted apartment. A few weeks ago, I posted a strange occurrence in my apartment where I heard a girl or a woman say, "Uh-oh," one night when I was alone. Since then, I've been compiling a list of other weird things that have happened in my apartment. As I go over them, I can't help but wonder what other people would think. It all started in early 2021. I'd moved into the apartment in late 2019, and for the first year and a half, I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. But all that changed one day. I was hanging out with some friends in a Discord voice chat when I glanced down the length of my hallway. Just by turning my head, I could see down the hallway into the dining room, and from there, I could see my desk. To my surprise, I saw what looked like a shadow of a woman's arm in the doorway of the dining room, as if the woman it was connected to was standing just inside, out of sight. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shadow, but I saw it clear enough that it caught my attention. It was still there after I looked away once or twice. I was about to tell the Discord chat about it when it finally disappeared. I convinced myself I hadn't seen anything at all. A few months later, sometime around November 2021, February 2022, I was awakened one night by what sounded like a choir singing. It was as if people were singing in my room. Now, there is a church next door, but I've never heard them practice before. It was around 3 a.m. in the morning. I lay there fully awake, very confused, until the noise finally stopped. I convinced myself that it was only a very late-night practice for the church next door. Over a year later, earlier this year, I was sitting on the couch in the living room playing solitaire on my phone, and preparing to get ready for bed. As I sat there, fully awake and aware of all the noises around me, I heard a young woman or maybe a child's voice say, "Uh-oh," from the direction of the dining room. I've heard other people's TVs and sounds from the apartments around me before, but they all sounded muffled and quiet. This wasn't. It was clear and loud. A couple of weeks later, I was in the dining room, bent over, grabbing a couple of water bottles from the cask in the corner of the room. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught some movement. I watched as something, perhaps a lady's skirt, moved from one corner of the room to the other. This wasn't just something that I saw and then wasn't there when I went to look back. I watched as it moved across the floor for several seconds. I never thought to stand up and turn around. Why, I'll never know. Finally, last night, I was listening to someone on YouTube talk about a 1980 film, when suddenly, along with the audio from the video, I heard what sounded like a woman's wordless, barely audible whispering right next to my left ear. It stopped me in my tracks. I frowned, rewound the video to where I had first heard it, and it simply wasn't there. It had never been in the video. All of these incidents have left me wondering what was going on in my apartment. Is it haunted, or is it just my imagination? I've tried to explain these things away, but the more they happen, the less I'm able to do so. The incident that stands out the most to me is the girl and young woman saying, "Uh-oh," in the dining room. It was so clear and loud that it couldn't be explained away by any logical means. And the fact that it was heard in the same room where I saw the shadow of a woman's arm and where I saw something move across the floor only adds to the mystery. I've tried to come up with explanations for these strange events. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I'm tired, stressed, and just imagining things. Or perhaps there's something paranormal happening in my apartment. I have tried to research the history of the building and the surrounding area to see if there's anything that might explain these things. So far, I haven't found anything that would suggest that the building's haunted, or that anything unusual happened in the area. At this point, I'm not sure what to do. Should I try to ignore these strange things and hope that they go away, or should I try to investigate further? The idea of investigating further is intriguing and terrifying. What if I find out something sinister is happening in my apartment? I have talked to some friends about it and what's been happening in my apartment, but they all seem skeptical. They think I'm overreacting or that there must be some logical explanation for what I'm experiencing. But I know what I've seen and heard, and I can't explain it away. I've also considered reaching out to paranormal investigators to see if they can shed any light on what's been happening in my apartment, but I'm not sure if I'm ready for that level of investigation. For now, I'm just going to try to stay calm and continue to document any strange occurrences in my apartment. Maybe one day I'll find a logical explanation for what's been happening. Or maybe I'll uncover something that I never expected to find. Either way, I know that I'll never forget the strange events that have taken place in my apartment. Strange something from the other side. I still vividly remember the day when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I started getting into these really morbid thinking patterns. It happened all after asking my mom what happened when we died, and her answer left me feeling shaken. "No one really knows," she said. "Some people think we go to heaven. Some people think we're reborn, but mostly people think it's likely nothing. Everything just ends." That thought rattled around my head for a while, and the next day I couldn't stop thinking about how someday I'm going to die and there's no way to escape it. I felt like living was pointless. If it was just going to end up abruptly someday, possibly without any warning, die. So I decided I'd rather just die right then and there. This thought consumed me, and I just kept wishing it, thinking it over and over. "I want to die now, just take me now." I repeated my mantra all day and night. The next day I woke up and felt a really strange sensation. It was like a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach that filled my whole being with dread. We had these marble stairs at my parents' house that were really slippery, and I used to race up and down them all the time and fall a lot. My knees were always bruised and my shins had painful bumps on them from falling. I bet you all remember that from your youth, how painful those shin bumps get. Anyway, that day I was walking down the stairs from the top floor, uncharacteristically slowly and carefully, but my flip-flop got caught on the stair, and I felt myself begin to fall. Suddenly I was enveloped with this white, wispy, cloud-like apparition. The space it occupied around me felt cool, had no real form or shape, but it felt like it was cognizant. It seemed to be asking me if I really meant I wanted to die. Panic filled me and I thought, no, I don't really want to. Suddenly, as it appeared, the white cloudy entity disappeared, and I was at the bottom of the stairs on my feet. I'm more of a skeptic when it comes to these things, so I often tried to think of a scientific explanation for what I saw and felt that day. Was it fainting, a seizure maybe? But even after all these years, I can't explain it. I still think of this event often, and I never told any of my family except my husband a few years back. It's a memory that stuck with me, and I've often been wondering about some sort of divine intervention or just a coincidence. All I know is that it made me think twice about the things I wished for and the power of my thoughts. Now, as an adult, I realize that death is a natural part of life, and that we should cherish the time we have with our loved ones. But that experience has stayed with me, and I'll never forget the strange white wispy cloud that seemed to be asking me if I really was being sure about what I was wishing for. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe it was something more. Either way, it's a memory that stayed with me for all these years. A dark time in my life. In October 2018, I decided to move in with my girlfriend for the first time. I'll refer to her as Jane. Little did I know what would happen in the 5 months that would follow. If I knew, I would never have agreed to move in. I vividly remember the night that everything started. It was a very important night, and I'll come back to this part later in the story. One night, Jane's mother and brother came over to stay with us. Unfortunately, I wasn't feeling very well, so I decided to relax in our bedroom while they hung out on the porch till late at night. Jane came in at some point and asked if I needed anything. She seemed genuinely concerned. A little while after that, I was in bed alone with my eyes closed when I felt a hand on my arm, and I opened my eyes. Jane was kneeling next to our bed, touching me, and asked if I needed anything again. She had a really condescending look on her face, which was initially just annoying to me. I replied that I was fine. I closed my eyes again, hoping she'd let me rest. A minute later, I opened my eyes again because I didn't hear her leave the room or open the door to leave. She was gone. I looked next to the bed because I was thinking, is this crazy chick laying on the floor or something? She wasn't there, so I looked at the door and saw the hallway light coming from underneath it. Now, I was never asleep, and I was questioning how I never saw the light shine in when she came in the room or heard it. I went to text her to see if she had just come in the room again, but decided against it. I didn't ask at this point because I didn't want to seem crazy to her family that was over, and honestly, I knew that that was the right choice. She had never come into the room. A few nights after that, I remember laying in bed with Jane and feeling her hand touch my thigh, and then I felt the fingers drag away. She was asleep, and I was creeped out. Eventually, I told her about it the first night, and we both just agreed that it was something really weird. We both just brushed it off. About a week after that first incident, I woke up in the middle of the night and I saw a black sphere just floating in the corner of the room near the ceiling. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and at this point, I was wide awake and it was still there. It started to move towards me across the room, got about a foot away from my face and stared into it. What I saw was facial features more lion-like than human. I remember big teeth, and what instantly stood out to me was that its face looked very condescending. I felt like whatever this was, it wanted me to know that it was the same thing I crossed paths with weeks prior. I told Jane about the things that were happening, and she never thought I was lying, but I'll admit that there were times I seriously started to question myself, until things started happening to other people around me. I'll get into that soon. One day I went out to our back porch to smoke, and when I stopped outside, the porch light dimmed way down. I thought she turned on a machine in the house or something. I went to tighten the bulb, but there was a glass fixture around where it was screwed in, and I just decided I didn't feel like getting a screwdriver. A minute later, I came back full strength as always. This porch can't be accessed from anywhere inside the apartment. It's screened in. There's no other door to the outside. The next few days were a blur to me. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. I couldn't stay in that apartment for any longer, and I had to get out of there. I was afraid for my life, and I knew that if I stayed there any longer, something terrible would happen to me. I started looking for a new place. I didn't want to live alone, so I looked for a roommate. After a few days of searching, I found someone that was looking for a roommate too. We met, and I told him everything that had happened to me, and he believed me and offered to let me stay with him until I found a new place to live. A few days later, I moved in with my new roommate, and I felt safer there, but I was still haunted by what had happened to me, and I couldn't sleep. I was afraid to be alone. One day, I woke up to a loud noise in the middle of the night. I went to investigate, and I saw the front door was wide open. I was alone in the apartment, and I knew that I had locked the door before I went to bed. I searched the apartment, but there was no one there. I started to think that whatever was haunting me had followed me to this new place. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to seek help of a paranormal investigator. The investigator came to my apartment, and we went through the place with all this equipment. We found nothing unusual, and he told me that there was no evidence of any paranormal activity in the apartment. I was relieved, but still didn't feel safe. I decided to see a therapist. I needed to talk to someone about what had happened to me. The therapist listened to my story and told me that what I experienced was probably a manifestation of my own fears or anxieties. He said that I needed to confront my fears and try to move on from what had happened. Over time, I started to feel better. I no longer felt like something was following me, and I was able to sleep at night. I moved into a new place and I started a new chapter of my life. Looking back on that time, I still don't know what to make of it, though. Was it all in my head? Was it a manifestation of my own fears and anxieties? Or was there really something paranormal going on? I may never know the answer, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget those 5 months that I spent with Jane. It was a time in my life that changed me forever, and I'll always be haunted by the memories of what happened in that apartment. Something odd happened when my sister had a bad trip on shrooms. I remember a similar experience I had a few years ago. It was a beautiful summer evening, and I was with a group of friends sitting around a campfire in the woods. We decided to take some mushrooms, and I remember feeling a sense of excitement mixed with a little bit of nervousness. It wasn't my first time taking them, but I was always a little apprehensive about it and the unpredictable nature of the experience. As the night progressed, we all started to feel the effects of the mushrooms. The colors around us seemed brighter, and the sounds of nature more intense, and the stars above us appeared to be dancing. We all had moments of deep introspection, and I remembered feeling a sense of oneness with the universe. But then when my friend started having a bad trip, she became paranoid and convinced that someone was watching us. We tried to calm her down, but nothing seemed to work. Eventually, we decided it would be best if we took her home. As we were walking back to the car, my friend turned to me and said, "I feel like I've lived this day so many times." Her words struck me as profound, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was tapping into some sort of universal truth. We finally made it back to her house, and I put on her favorite TV show and tried to distract her. She seemed to be doing better, so I decided to head home. But as I was walking out the door, I heard a loud pounding on the front door. It was past midnight, and I couldn't imagine who'd be knocking at this hour. My friend looked at me with fear in her eyes. I couldn't tell, but maybe something wasn't right with her. I asked her if she knew who it was, but she said she didn't. The knocking continued, and I decided to go downstairs and check it out. As I opened the front door, I was greeted by nothingness. There was no one there. I turned around to go back upstairs and found that my friend was frozen in terror at the top. She said she heard knocking on the side of the window. But when we checked, no one there also. We both felt a sense of unease and decided to stay up a while longer. My friend asked me to pour cold water on her head and try to snap her out of it, and I did. Slowly she started to come back to reality, and we both realized that something strange had just happened. I don't know if it was the mushrooms or if there was something else at play, but that experience stuck with me, made me wonder if there are other dimensions or realities out there that we can't perceive with our normal senses. Or maybe it was just a strange coincidence. Either way, it was a night I won't forget. Paranormal experience. So yeah, let me tell you about this really interesting experience I had with this necklace that I won on an online auction. It was a beautiful piece, and I was pretty proud of myself for winning the bid. The seller was a German man, so it took a while for the package to arrive, but when it finally did, I couldn't wait to put it on. From the moment I held it in my hands, I felt a strange connection to it, too. I started wearing the necklace every day, and for the first month, everything seemed fine. But then weird things started happening to me. And it was on a Sunday or Saturday morning. I remember being in a relaxed state, maybe even half asleep, when I heard the voice of a little girl talking to me. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I was certain that it was a girl's voice. The strange part was that everyone else in the house was asleep, so it made me freak out a little bit. Then another strange event happened on Wednesday night. It was around 10 p.m., and I usually go to bed around 9 or 9:30. I was feeling relaxed, and I was in that half-asleep state, half-awake state, when I realized I was hearing a female voice, humming a tune that I could recognize. The thing is, my parents were downstairs, and my brother was sleeping, so I couldn't figure out where the voice was coming from. It scared me at first, but I tried to brush it off and just let myself fall asleep. After these events, I talked to my mother about what was happening. You see, I always had a tendency to see weird things and have strange experiences, but I had never really talked to anybody about it before. My mom was trying to understand why this was happening to me, and we had a long talk in private. As we were discussing possible reasons, she mentioned something about my room, and that's when it hit me. The necklace. It was a vintage piece from the 1920s or 30s, and I suddenly had a hunch that it might be related to the strange occurrences. I decided to take some action just to be safe. I got some holy water and poured it over the necklace, hoping that it would cleanse whatever energy was attached to it. After that, I did have a few more events, but I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me again. Despite the strange experiences, I couldn't bring myself to stop wearing the necklace. There was something about it that drew me in, Even with all the unexplained occurrences, I felt like there were memories of the girl who had worn the necklace before me still lingering within it. It's hard to explain, but I didn't mind. In fact, I found it somewhat comforting to think that a part of her was still in the necklace. But it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about this piece of jewelry. I continued to wear the necklace every day, and over time, the strangest events seemed to subside. I learned to accept that there might be just some mystery surrounding the necklace, but it didn't bother me anymore. In fact, I grew to appreciate the unique history and the energy that the necklace seemed to possess. It became a part of my daily routine, and I found myself feeling a sense of connection to the girl who had worn it before me. Years have passed since I first won the necklace, and I still wear it to this day. It's become a cherished item in my collection, and I often find myself wondering about the girl who owned it. What was her story? Why did the necklace seem to have a mysterious effect on me? Was it just my imagination, or was there something more to it? These questions plagued my mind as I continued to wear the necklace every day, despite the strange occurrences that seemed to be connected to it. One day, while doing some research about the necklace's origins, I came across a news article from the 1920s that caught my attention. It was about a young girl who had gone missing in Germany during that time period. The article mentioned that she had been wearing a distinctive necklace similar to the one I now possessed. Could it be possible that this necklace was somehow connected to that missing girl? The thought sent chills down my spine, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that the necklace was not just a piece of jewelry, but held some kind of deeper significance. I decided to dig deeper into the history of the necklace and its previous owners. After some extensive research, I discovered that the necklace had indeed belonged to a young girl named Anna who had gone missing in Germany in the 1920s. She was never found, and her disappearance remained a mystery. The necklace had been up for auction by a collector who had acquired it from a real estate, and that's how it ended up in my possession. Armed with this newfound information, I couldn't help but feel a strong sense of curiosity and intrigue. I wanted to know more about Anna and what had happened to her. I reached out to local historians and even managed to track down some of Anna's distant relatives in Germany. Through my conversations with them, I learned that Anna had been a young girl with a passion for music. She had been an aspiring singer and had a beautiful voice. She had worn the necklace as a lucky charm during her performances, and it was known to hum a particular tune that was her favorite. As I delved deeper into Anna's story, I realized that the strange occurrences I had experienced, such as hearing a little girl's voice and humming in my half-awake state, seemed to align with Anna's interests and habits. It was as if the spirit was somehow connected to the necklace itself, and her presence was still lingering in it. Despite the initial fear and confusion, I began to sense empathy towards Anna. I could understand her love for music and her attachment to the necklace. It became clear to me that Anna's spirit was not haunting me, but rather seeking some kind of connection or recognition. I decided to embrace Anna's presence and honor her memory. I started to learn the tune that she would hum, and I practiced singing it. I also visited her hometown in Germany, where I paid my respects to her grave and left flowers in her memory. As time went on, the strange occurrences gradually subsided, but I continued to wear the necklace every single day. It became more than just a piece of jewelry to me. It was a symbol of a young girl's dreams and passions, and a reminder that the mysterious connection I had experienced. I shared Anna's story with my close friends and family, and they were all fascinated by the tale of the necklace and its history. Some were skeptical, dismissing it as a mere superstition, while others were more open-minded and intrigued by the possibility of the supernatural. Regardless of others' opinions, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for having had this unique experience myself. It had opened my eyes to the mysteries of the world that made me realize that there were still many things beyond my comprehension, and it had also given me a sense of empathy towards those that had experienced unexplained phenomenon or had beliefs in the supernatural. Years passed and I continued to wear the necklace, but the strange occurrences had ceased completely. I had moved on with my life, but I still held a special place in my heart for Anna and the necklace. I had come to see it as a cherished memento, a connection to a young girl whose story that had touched me deeply. One day out of the blue, I received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 70s introduced herself as Gertrude, Anna's niece. She had heard about my interest in Anna's story and had come all the way from Germany to meet me. Gertrude explained that she had grown up hearing stories about her Aunt Anna and had disappeared so mysteriously all those years ago. She had inherited some of Anna's belongings, including old letters and photographs, but the necklace was missing. She had always wondered what had happened to it. When she learned that I had the necklace, and I had been wearing it all this time, she was overwhelmed with emotions. She told me that Anna had been very dear to her and her family, and they had always hoped for some closure or resolution about the mystery of her disappearance. As Gertrude and I talked, we shared our experiences and feelings about Anna. She was grateful to hear that I had honored Anna's memory and had tried to understand her story. She also confirmed that Anna had indeed been passionate about music and had loved to sing, and the necklace had been a significant symbol to her dreams. Gertrude expressed her desire to have the necklace back in the family, as she saw it as a precious heirloom that rightfully belonged to Anna's memory. I understood her sentiments and gladly handed over the necklace to her. It felt like the right thing to do, and I was glad to have played a part in bringing some closure to Anna's family. As Gertrude left, she thanked me with tears in her eyes and told me that she believed Anna's spirit had found peace knowing that her necklace was back with her family. I felt a sense of fulfillment and closure as well, knowing that I'd been able to honor Anna's memory and bring some comfort to her family. In the end, I realized that the mysterious effect of the necklace on me had been a combination of my own emotions and experiences, as well as the intriguing history and story behind it. It had led me on a unique journey of discovery and empathy, and it had ultimately brought a sense of resolution to a long-standing mystery. I continued to cherish the memory of Anna and the necklace, but the strange occurrences never returned. I learned to appreciate the beauty of life's mysteries and the wonders of the unknown, and I carried the lessons and memories of the experience with me for the rest of my life. Has anyone had similar encounters or have insight on the phenomenon I'll detail below? I never thought I'd be the type of person to believe in something like this, but lately I can't help but feel like there's something more going on than what meets the eye. It all started about 6 months ago, and I began to notice a presence around me at night. At first it was just a feeling like something was watching me, but then I started to see them, these shadow people that seemed to be everywhere. And the more I watched, the more I realized that there was something different about them. I've always believed that psilocybin could grow and allow us to perceive more than our normal senses allow. And maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe these entities are something that exists beyond our normal reality, something that we can only see when our minds are open to the possibility. I don't know, but I do know that these encounters are real, and they happen every night. The entities seem to be a combination of two different phenomena that people have been encountering forever. They start off as shadow people, but as I focus on them, their form seems to dissipate. And I'm left looking at actual human beings. Their fashion sense is even very modern too, like they could be walking down the street in any American city. But they're not solid at all, and they're pretty translucent, like ghostly-like. I currently live in a fenced-off vacant property in an urban area. I was hired to live here as security and clean up the property to prepare for development. But the recent price increases in construction supplies, the development companies put the project on hold, leaving me here with these entities as my only company. What's interesting is that they never arrive alone. There's typically dozens of them, broken up into little crowds doing their own thing. And while they seem to be silently communicating with each other, I can't hear anything at all. It's like there could be loud music or cheering from their perspective, but from mine it's completely silent. One thing that's really strange is that I never feel threatened or creeped out by their presence, even when they're watching me. Like they are over right now as I write this, I feel content and safe. If they were actual people, I would feel very uncomfortable and likely act hostile towards them depending on the circumstance. But these entities, I don't feel any negative vibes at all. I've tried to do some research online to see if there's anything out there that can explain what I'm experiencing, but I haven't found anything that matches up with what I'm seeing. That's why I've decided to reach out and try to obtain some understanding regarding my recent experiences. I don't know what these entities are or what they want, but I'm hoping that something out there can shed some light on the situation or someone. Any information is welcome, and I'm open to any questions, comments, or discussions that can help me achieve a better level of understanding. For now, I'll just keep observing and try to make a sense of what's happening around me. I've always been a believer that there's more to psilocybin than just hallucinations. To me, it feels like it can open up a portal to another dimension or reality, allowing us to perceive things that our normal senses don't allow. That being said, I recently experienced something that left me feeling completely puzzled. I'm hoping to gain some insight by sharing my story. It all started with my sisters took mushrooms at a campfire. One of them had a bad trip, so I had to go and get her. I brought her puppy with me and took her home, putting on the TV show Friends to help her settle down. Everything seemed back to normal, and I decided to head back to bed, leaving her downstairs. About 10 minutes later, I heard a pounding on the front door, and my sister was yelling my name. I started heading down the stairs, and she was heading up, looking very worried. I asked if someone was there, and she said that she didn't know. There was another knock on the door, and I started to feel uneasy. I opened the door, but there was nobody outside. My sister looked petrified and said she was sure she was about to die. I tried to calm her down and eventually went back downstairs with her. She made me dump cold water on her head a few times, and there were a couple more knocks on the side window, even though no one was there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there outside my house, even though I couldn't see it. This experience left me on edge for a few minutes, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was connected to my sister's bad trip, and if I was somehow experiencing something too. This event made me think back to my experiences with psilocybin and how it can open up portals to other dimensions or realities. It feels like we're able to perceive more than what our senses typically allow, and I wonder if this is what happened to me and my sister that night. I'm a skeptic by nature, and I always try to come up with a scientific explanation for my unusual experiences. However, this time I couldn't explain what happened, and it left me with more questions than answers. I've always been able to explore the unknown, but this experience left me feeling a bit uneasy. I'm now even more cautious about what else is out there that we can't see or explain. I've always believed that there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding, and it seems like I've been experiencing one of them for the past 6 months. I've seen what appear to be entities that have aspects of both shadow people and translucent ghosts. They usually make their presence known only at night, and they seem to be able to observe me as much as I'm observing them. I spend countless hours observing them, and I can say that for sure they're not threatening or giving off any negative vibes. These entities usually appear as shadow people at first, but once I focus on them, their shadow form dissipates, but they take on the form of a human being. They're translucent and seem to be dressed in modern fashion. It's almost as if they're attending a party with dozens of individuals broken up into little groups doing their own thing. I can't hear anything from my perspective, but from their perspective, there could be loud music or cheering voices. I have been living in a fenced-off vacant property in an urban area, hired to serve as security to prevent trespassing and clean up the property. The property was supposed to be in development with plans to build an apartment complex on it, but the project's been on hold due to skyrocketing prices of lumber and construction supplies. So I've been here for quite some time, spending my time on the presence in these entities. One thing that surprises me is that I don't feel threatened or creeped out by them when they're around. I don't even feel bothered when they're watching me, which is the case as I write this. There are at least 2 of them fixated on me. And as though it's a bit eerie regarding the overall situation, the actual presence and watchfulness don't bother me at all. I have tried to find information online about this specific phenomenon, but I've come up empty-handed. I don't know what these entities are or what they want, and I've been trying to understand them better and find some explanation for what I'm experiencing. But so far, I've been unsuccessful. I don't know if they're trying to communicate with me or they're just passing through. In conclusion, I'm reaching out to anyone who might have some insight to this phenomenon. I welcome any information, questions, or comments that could help me achieve a better understanding of what I'm experiencing. Thank you for taking the time to read my post, and I hope that all together we can shed some light on this mysterious phenomenon and why the text repeats itself so many times. Ghost cats? Ghost dogs? Ghost animals? Have you ever experienced the presence of a ghostly animal? Perhaps a feline friend or a spectral pup? I have, and it's left me feeling equal parts spooked and fascinated. It all started a few months ago when I first noticed a ghostly cat in my home. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as time went on, I couldn't ignore the strange sightings any longer. The cat could appear out of nowhere, dissipating into thin air as soon as it sensed the gaze. At times, it seemed to fade in and out of visibility, leaving me feeling like I was losing my mind. As the days passed, I started to see more and more ghostly cats around me. Some were tuxedo cats, others were fluffy white cats and tabby spots, and there were even a ginger and a white cat that made an appearance. Each one was as see-through as the last, and I knew that for sure they weren't my own pets. I have a Russian blue mixed with a mackerel bobby-tailed tabby, both of which looked nothing like the ghost cats. But it wasn't just cats that I was seeing. One day I caught the sight of a ghostly dog that looked uncannily like my own. It was more white than my dog, but the resemblance was striking. I wondered if it could be a relative of my pet, but then I remembered that my dog was the only one of its kind in the area. The sightings continued, and I continued to wonder with these ghost animals and why they were appearing to me. Were they lost spirits, trapped between this world and the next, or were they simply figments of my overactive imagination? Despite my unease, I found myself growing more and more intrigued by these ghostly creatures. I started doing research, reading up on paranormal activity and the ways in which ghosts manifest themselves. I even visited a psychic medium, hoping to get some answers. The medium was able to sense the presence of the ghostly animals around me, confirming my suspicions that there were indeed spirits from another realm. She told me that these ghosts were drawn to me for some reason, but she couldn't say why that reason was. Instead, she advised me to keep an open mind and embrace the spiritual world around me. And so, that's what I've been doing. Every time I see one of these ghostly animals, I try to connect with it, to understand why it's there and what it's trying to tell me. It's not always easy. The spirits are elusive and hard to communicate with, but I'm determined to keep trying. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand the presence of these ghostly animals in my life, but I'm grateful for the experience and for the chance to explore the unknown. Who knows what other mysteries the world has in store for me? I think my mom has a demon attached to her. I recently made the difficult decision to cut contact with my mother. It wasn't an easy choice, but after years of dealing with her narcissistic behavior in the presence of malevolent spirits that seemed to be attached to her, I realized it was the best option for my own well-being. It's a complicated situation, and while I won't deny that there are other reasons for our estrangement, the spirit was definitely a factor. It all started when I was just 6 years old. My mother and her friend became interested in witchcraft after watching the movie The Craft. As someone who's pagan myself, I know that playing with things you don't understand is never a good idea. My mother started off with well-intentioned blessings and some folklore magic, but things quickly spiraled out of control. She used random objects to reach out to spirits, believing anything that would respond and move an object. When we moved into our home, things got more active and weirder. I remember at first we moved in, a spirit would slam our basement door shut and stomp down the stairs. At first I thought it was just my parents having a fight, but they were always sleeping in their room when this happened. The dining room chairs would move on their own, with the chairs being pulled out or pushed in when we left them out. The most terrifying experience was when we left the chairs pushed in at the table, and after we were leaving the room, a few moments, we heard the scuff of a chair on the floor. When we looked, the chairs were resting on the top of the table face down, like they do in bars when they close up for the night. But that was just the beginning. We heard someone yell, "Shut the fuck up," from the basement when my parents were yelling at my brother and me. I don't blame the ghost, honestly. One night, my brother and I complained of smelling rotting meat and decay. We heard what sounded like a dog fight happening in the basement, but we only had one dog at the time, and she ran to hide because she heard it too. Those were just the most notable situations that happened, besides hearing small children singing old schoolhouse songs at 4 or 5 in the morning when we were just kids. Every once in a while you could hear a growl, not a dog growl, but a gravelly, gritty, deep growl, damn near in your face. When my parents divorced, we moved into my grandmother's house next door, but that house was also haunted. With the sound of a woman crying around 11 at night almost every night, The objects being thrown around got so bad that my dad had to keep me at his house, which was also haunted. My mom eventually moved into another town, but the houses she lived in were also haunted. My stepdad got pushed downstairs and later got scratched badly. My mom was shoved into a wall so hard her ribs cracked. The spirit seemed to change people's attitudes on a whim. Calm moments would become violent and unnecessarily angry. Now my mom claims that her brother's spirit is around after he committed suicide, and my stepdad claims the same thing about his brother. They both claim to have seen a black hooded mass in their new home. My mom has seen a child in the kitchen when my brother was in school, and she heard the child singing or crying. Before I cut contact with her, I would house sit for her, and would have gruesome nightmares and be awoken by an odd jolting feeling, like being electrocuted but with a sense of anxiety. It scared me so much that I couldn't stay the night, and after I woke up I felt fine. However, the experience left me feeling uneasy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That wasn't the first time I felt this way around my house, and I knew that it wouldn't be the last. As the years went by, my mother and I moved from one haunted house to another, and the hauntings only got worse. It seemed like no matter where we went, the same aggressive spirit followed us, like a lovesick puppy, and it was a complete fucking asshole. I couldn't help but wonder where my mother had picked up this thing that attached to her, and if there was any way to get rid of it without hurting anyone. If it was a demon, what kind was it? Babadook? Christian lore type? The ghost of a pissed-off chicken that KFC slaughtered? I needed to better understand what it was doing so I could repel things like it, keep it away from me and others. But that was easier said than done, and all these years the spirit continued to follow my mother, and it seemed like it was just waiting for an opportunity to jump to someone else or continue messing with people. It was a disturbing thought that this entity may still be out there looking for another victim to haunt. As for the origin of the entity, it's difficult to say. It's possible that it was somehow connected to the witchcraft that my mother and her friends were experimenting with when I was a child. It may have been attracted to the energy and the attention that they were giving to the spirit world, and latched onto my mother as a result. It's also possible that the entity was connected to the properties that we lived in, particularly the old mining house that my mother moved to, the tunnels that once connected the house that they have created a portal to the entirely different world. Whatever its origins may be, the important thing is to find a way to repel it and prevent it from causing harm to anyone else. If it's a demon or malevolent spirit, it may require a spiritual cleansing or exorcism to remove it. Seeking the help of a professional psychic or spiritual healer may be necessary too. It's also important to protect oneself from negative energies and entities by practicing spiritual protection methods such as visualization, prayer, and the use of protective crystals and herbs. In conclusion, my experiences with the malevolent entity that followed my mother have been frightening and traumatic. It's something that I don't wish on anyone, and I hope that by sharing my story, others may be better prepared to deal with similar situations if they ever arise. The paranormal world is a mysterious and often scary place, and it's important to approach it with caution and respect. More weirdness in my otherwise peaceful home. Yesterday evening, I decided to move the phone mount on my motorcycle. The bike was parked on her back deck under the pagoda. My garage was currently filled with my son's old furniture from his apartment. It was getting dark, but I figured it wouldn't take long, so I went ahead with the task. Moving the phone mount was a relatively easy job, but it did require some light. I got the mount into position. I wanted to tighten it enough to stay in place using the small torque screws that came with the kit. I intended to wait until morning to tighten them properly, as it was getting dark and I couldn't see them very well. Once the screws were tight enough to hold the mount in place, I stuck the small wrench that came with the kit on the magnet on the backside of the mount and called it a day. And this morning, when I went out to finish the job, I couldn't find the wrench or the magnet where I'd left it. I searched the whole area, but it was nowhere to be found. I assumed a squirrel or some other animal must have taken it, like the shiny wrench, as it had happened before. As I was about to go inside to get a regular Torx wrench from my toolbox, I noticed that my windshield bag was unsnapped, which was weird because I was very conscientious about keeping it snapped shut. I kept some small items in it that I didn't want to lose. When I checked the bag to my surprise, the wrench was inside, right on top. I found this strange, but I reasoned that maybe I'd struck the wrench to the magnet and I'd put it in the bag instead. It was a plausible explanation, and I didn't think much of it. However, when I tried to tighten the mount screws, I realized that they were already fully tightened and I couldn't tighten them any further. They were completely wrenched down. This feeling left me a little freaked out, and I talked to my wife and son. Both of them denied touching the bike. I wasn't scared, but I was definitely weirded out by the whole situation. It seemed like something inexplicable had happened with the phone mount and the wrench. I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling, and I started to wonder if there was something supernatural or paranormal at play. I've heard stories of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomenon, but I haven't experienced anything like this before. It made me question my logical explanations and rational thinking. Throughout the day, I couldn't help but keep thinking about the incident. I went back to the bike several times, checking the mount and the screws, but everything seemed to be in place. I even tried to recreate the scenario, but I couldn't explain how the screws had tightened on their own. As the day went on, my curiosity turned into a sense of intrigue. I began researching online to see if anyone else had experienced similar incidents with their motorcycle and other objects. I came across forums and stories of people who had encountered strange happenings on their bikes, including unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and even the sightings of ghostly figures near their motorcycles. While I was initially skeptical, the sheer number of accounts and testimonials made me question my skepticism. I delved deeper into the world of the paranormal experience and theories, trying to find answers to what had happened to my motorcycle. I also reached out to a fellow motorcycle enthusiast and asked if they had ever encountered anything similar. Some shared their own eerie stories, while others dismissed it as mere coincidence or natural explanations. Nevertheless, the conversations and discussions added to my fascination with the inexplicable events surrounding my motorcycle. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake off the mystery of what had happened to my motorcycle. I became obsessed with finding an explanation, spending hours researching, reading books and articles, and even consulting with experts in the field of the paranormal phenomena. I visited local motorcycle shops and asked if they had heard of similar incidents, but most of them dismissed it as pure coincidence or simply shrugged it off. However, my determination to uncover the truth only grew stronger. I set up cameras around my motorcycle, hoping to capture any unusual activity. I even stayed up late into the night, keeping a vigilant watch, hoping to catch a mysterious occurrence. Weeks turned into months, and despite my efforts, I couldn't find any concrete evidence or explanations for what had happened with my motorcycle. The mount remained secure and the screws stayed tightly fastened. The wrench remained in my toolbox, and there are no more unsnapped bags or strange occurrences. But my curiosity and fascination with the paranormal world continued to grow. I delved deeper into the subject, studying different theories and researching various cases of unexplained phenomena. I connected with others who had experienced similar encounters and exchanged stories and ideas. One day, while browsing through an online forum, I came across a thread discussing supernatural experiences with motorcycles. Some of the stories were eerily similar to what had happened to me. Many riders shared their encounters with unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and inexplicable occurrences surrounding their bikes. Some even claimed to have seen apparitions or felt a strange presence around their motorcycle. One story in particular caught my attention. A fellow rider had shared a similar experience with their phone mount and wrench mysteriously disappearing and reappearing in unexpected places. They also tried to find logical explanations, but eventually concluded that there might be something supernatural at play. This thread led me down a rabbit hole of paranormal stories related to motorcycles. I found tales of haunted roads, cursed bikes, and mysterious motorcycle-related legends from all around the world. The stories were diverse and intriguing, ranging from encounters and ghost riders, from sightings of phantom motorcycles, and even tales of motorcycles that seemed to have a mind of their own. While I was initially skeptical, the sheer volume of stories and accounts from fellow riders made me question my rational explanations. I began to consider the possibility that there might be some truth to these paranormal experiences. As my obsession grew, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I reached out to investigators and experts in the field, seeking their help in unraveling the mystery surrounding my bike. I invited them to my home and showed them the camera footage and shared my story in detail. The investigators were intrigued by my experience and conducted thorough investigations around my bike. They used various equipment including EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and EVP recorders to capture any sign of paranormal activity. We spent several nights monitoring my bike, hoping to capture any unexplained occurrence. Although we didn't capture any definitive evidence, the investigators couldn't fully explain some of the anomalies that we did witness. There were unexplained fluctuations in the electromagnetic fields around the bike, and some of the thermal images showed unusual heat signatures. We also captured some EVP recordings with some mysterious voices that couldn't be explained. The investigators concluded that while there's no concrete evidence of supernatural activity, there were indications that something out of the ordinary might be happening with my bike. They suggested that it could be a case of residual energy or manifestation of a spirit or entity attached to the motorcycle. Armed with this new information, I continued my research and exploration into the world of the paranormal phenomenon. I connected with other riders that had similar encounters and formed a small community of enthusiasts that shared their stories and theories. We discussed possible explanations ranging from residual energy from previous owners to spirits attached to objects to dimensional portals. Despite not finding a definitive answer to what was happening with my motorcycle, my fascination just kept growing stronger. I became increasingly invested in uncovering the truth and understanding the mysterious occurrence that seemed to defy logical explanation. I spent countless hours scouring books, websites, and forums looking for any clue that could shed light on the inexplicable events surrounding my motorcycle. I reached out to experts in the field of the paranormal research seeking their insight and opinions. I even went on road trips to visit haunted sites and locations known for motorcycle-related legends, hoping to find some answers. During my investigations, I encountered other riders who had experienced similar inexplicable events with their motorcycles. We exchanged stories, shared our theories, and tried to piece together the puzzle. Some believed it was the work of mischievous spirits, while others thought it could be a case of residual energy from previous owners or even a glitch in the fabric of reality. As time went on, I began to experience more strange occurrences around my motorcycle. There were instances of my motorcycle starting up on its own, despite the ignition being off and lights flickering. There were also times when I felt an eerie presence around my bike as if something or someone was watching me. One night, as I was conducting another investigation around my bike, I noticed a faint glow around the phone mount. As I approached it, the glow seemed to intensify, and I could feel a palpable energy in the air. I cautiously reached out to touch the mount, and as soon as my fingers made contact, I felt a jolt of energy surging through my body. Startled, I pulled my hand back, and the glow dissipated. I was both fascinated and terrified by the experience. It was clear to me that there was something beyond the realm of the ordinary at play here. But what could it be? I decided to dig deeper into my research, exploring more esoteric and lesser-known theories about the intersection of the paranormal and motorcycles. I came across stories of ancient rituals involving motorcycles, tales of motorcycle clubs with secretive occult practices, and even accounts of motorcycles being used as conduits to otherworldly entities. One particular theory that intrigued me was the concept of a motorcycle guardian spirit. According to some beliefs, motorcycles can develop a spiritual presence that protects and watches over their riders. These guardian spirits are said to have their own consciousness and can sometimes exhibit mischievous or malevolent behavior if not appeased or respected. Armed with this, I decided to approach my motorcycle with a different mindset. I began to acknowledge and respect the possibility of a guardian spirit attached to my bike. I would offer prayers and blessings and even performed a ritual of gratitude expressing my appreciation for my motorcycle and its mysterious presence. To my surprise, the strange occurrences around my motorcycle seemed to subside after my change in approach. The mount remained secure and the screws stayed tightly fastened. The wrench remained in my toolbox and there were no more unsnapped bags or unexplained phenomenon. It seemed as though the guardian spirit, if indeed there was one, had accepted my gestures of respect and appreciation. With time, my initial fear and uncertainty gave way to a sense of wonder and awe. I realized that there are still many mysteries in the world that defied rational explanations, and that some phenomena were beyond the reach of science and logic. I continued to share my story and experiences with other riders and enthusiasts, hoping to inspire curiosity and open-mindedness toward the unexplained. I became known as the motorcycle paranormal guy, and was even invited to speak at local motorcycle clubs and events about my journey about the world and the paranormal and motorcycles. In the end, while I never found a definitive answer to the strange occurrences surrounding my motorcycle, my journey led me to a deeper appreciation for the mysteries of the universe and the intricate connections between the physical and metaphysical realms. I learned to approach the unknown with an open mind, to respect the possibility of unseen forces at play, and to be willing to explore unconventional explanations. My experience had taught me that there were countless mysteries waiting to be unraveled, and that the human understanding of reality was limited to our current knowledge and perceptions. As time passed, my motorcycle became more than just a mode of transportation. It became a symbol of curiosity, exploration, and the unexplained. It served as a reminder that there were still realms beyond our comprehension, and that there were forces at play in the world that defied conventional understanding. I continued to enjoy riding my bike, relishing the freedom and the thrill that it brought me. But now, with a newfound reverence for the unknown, I remained vigilant, keeping an eye for any further unexplained events, but also embracing the mystery and the notion that some things may never have a definitive explanation. Occasionally, I would still notice a faint glow around the phone mount, and I would offer a silent nod of acknowledgement, acknowledging the possibility of the guardian spirit that might still be watching over my motorcycle. But whatever it was a playful spirit, a residual energy, or simply a series of coincidences. I'd come to accept that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. In the end, my journey into the world of the paranormal and motorcycles had not only expanded my understanding of the unknown, but had also enriched my life with a sense of wonder and awe. I had opened my mind to the new perspectives, deepened my appreciation for the intricacies of the universe, and given me a unique story to share with others. So, as I continued to ride my motorcycle with the phone mount securely in place and the wrench safely in my toolbox, I'm reminded of the enigmatic nature of our world and the infinite possibilities that lie beyond our comprehension. And while I may never have a definitive answer to the strange occurrences surrounding my motorcycle, I am confident in knowing that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and that the unknown will always hold a sense of intrigue and fascination for those willing to embrace its enigmatic allure. When I was younger, I experienced some pretty strange things in my house. There were two incidents in particular that stood out to me. The first one happened while I was doing laundry in my room. I happened to glance over at my closet and saw one of my pant legs fly out like it was being blown around, and I heard a loud noise like an elephant. The thing was, there were no vents or anything else that would have caused the air to blow like that. The closet was narrow and the door was off, so no one could have hidden inside. I even kept the door shut so my cat couldn't come in. It was the same room where my sister swore that a box had jumped in the air. She didn't imagine it because the cat actually hissed at the box when it happened. I would also hear rustling plastic bags, but I suppose it could have just been a rodent. But what was really strange is that I'd often hear my sister walking past my room to get to hers, but I'd go to greet her only to find no one there. The second incident happened in the backyard when I was playing with my dog late at night. He was a big husky, and he was usually fearless, but I saw him hunker down across the yard and whine before running over to me in the deck. I decided to investigate and found a very tall, dark brown, glossy-looking thing standing in a narrow alley between the shed and the fence. It was half covered in shadow, so I couldn't see its head or any other detail, but it looked like a straight body with soggy, wet brown fur. I didn't hear anything, and my knees started shaking to the point where I thought they would give out. I ran back inside, scared out of my wits. I later saw a strange-looking face at the same spot while looking out the upstairs window, but I was far away, so I could have imagined that. For the record, no one died in the house as far as we knew. My dad had built the whole second floor, the garage, and the shed in the back, and half the basement. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Maybe one of my siblings, or I, had brought something paranormal into the house. But I believed that the negative energy that hung around could have caused strange things to happen. My mother was emotionally abusive to my siblings and me, and she even got physical with us several times. Perhaps her negative energy had an effect on the house. I always felt uneasy in the hallway and refused to sleep in the bedroom alone until I was 13. I had pretty creepy dreams about that room while sleeping in it. In one dream, there was a witch in there, and in another dream, the light went out and I had to go get a new bulb. When I came back, there was a ghost dude standing in the middle of the room. I got so scared that I fell over, and that's when I woke up. The feeling of fear stayed with me throughout the whole day. All in all, I'm not sure what was going on in my house, but I know that those experiences were real. Perhaps it was all just coincidence, or maybe there was something paranormal happening. Whatever the case may be, those memories have stayed with me for a long time. Not so sure if I should share it here or someplace else, but this is an experience I've had. When I was a young lad around 5 or 7 years old, I used to work with my grandfather. Well, it was more like playing on his phone, but that's beside the point. One day while we were out, I found a stray yellow ball sitting in a ditch. It called out to me in a strange way. I couldn't resist taking it home with me. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. I didn't expect anything to happen, really. But on the third night, I had the urge to sleep with the ball in my bed because I wanted my old stuffed bear. I fell asleep quickly, but I woke up around 12 or 1 in the morning from a strange dream. In my dream, I was pushing a green cart from that ditch to where my grandparents' home was. There was a small child singing, and when I woke up, I found myself suffering from sleep paralysis. I slept on a bunk bed on the bottom bunk, and the top bunk was filled with boxes, so really nothing was able to be up there without sitting on the boxes. When I awoke, I found myself unable to move except my eyes. I saw a white fabric draped over the side of the top bunk. It was possibly a dress, and the singing was continuing. The only lyric I remembered that rings in my head is, "Put a smile on it," and something about sunshine. When I was finally able to move, I ran right out of the room, being too afraid to enter again. But when my grandfather woke up upset, he walked in, saw me the way I was, and after explaining, he grabbed the ball and stabbed it, destroying the vessel. This could have just been a coincidence, but before he stabbed it, I felt the ball and it was ice cold, and mind you, this was in Florida, and nothing should really be naturally ice cold. After that incident, a few years passed by, and I forgot about it all. Suddenly I woke up with sleep paralysis again, and there she was, the small girl standing in the distance. She was muttering something, and then she dashed straight towards me. I couldn't see her features since it was dark, but all I knew is that she wore a long white dress and had long dark brown, almost black hair that shadowed her face. Over the years I had other experiences that were similar to this one, just with singing and standing in the distance. But this one with the yellow ball and the girl in the white dress were the most unsettling to me. It left me wondering about the connection between the ball and the girl and what could have happened if my grandfather hadn't destroyed it. Was it a coincidence or was it something else? These questions linger in my mind to this day. During my elementary and middle school years, I attended a school that was situated right next to a graveyard. I, along with many other students, have witnessed strange things in the corners of our eyes, and have felt deep feelings of dread or sadness. The worst case, however, was when a few students complained about feeling as if they were being touched randomly, and how they sometimes felt as if there was a little pull on the grabbed part. One year, when I was in 5th grade, a new transfer student came in. He was a big, scaredy cat, and no one even warned him about the strange occurrences. During one class, he suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs as if he fell off his chair and started pointing at the classroom door. He claimed to have seen a hand holding a severed head with a big, creepy smile peeking out of it. At first, no one believed him since the classroom door was shut at the start of the lesson. I was probably the first person to look at the door to confirm what had happened, and to my surprise, I found it partially open. There was no sound of the door opening, which was a strange occurrence, since the door in that classroom was always so noisy. Luckily, this was the only major incident that happened throughout the rest of the years that I spent at the school, but there were no more panicking or other bizarre occurrences that happened other than the transfer student leaving the school. But 12 years later, I found out that there were actually some graves in the school area. The school had supposedly run out of space and needed more places to fit children. The graves had been there for a long time and no one visited them anyway. It was a load of bullcrap to say the least, I don't know if it was illegal or not, but the school authorities for sure weren't arrested. The strange happenings in that school made a lot of sense now. It's eerie to think about. I, along with my classmates, had been studying and playing so close to the graves of those who had passed away. The experiences made me believe that there are things beyond our understanding, and that we should always be aware of the history and significance of places that we inhabit. And it happened again. About 20 days ago, I had a foresight that I really didn't want to have come true. And unfortunately, just 2 days after posting about it, it did come true. It was fascinating and unsettling at the same time. And now, I've had another twitch, but this one is different. A couple of days ago, I saw imagery in my head of a city skyline at night, and what appeared to be my car parked on the side of the road. But this visualization gave me a sense of panic and anxiety. I don't know if it's a premonition or something bad happening to me, or if it's just my imagination running wild, but it's really bothering me. I felt compelled to share this experience with others, even though I know some may not believe me, but I'm hoping that someone can help me make sense of it all. Maybe someone can give me some insight into what it might mean or what I should do about it. If anyone needs more information about the image I saw, I can provide more details. It's a strange feeling to have these premonitions, especially when they feel so real and vivid. I don't know if they're just random thoughts or if they have some kind of significance, but I can't shake the feeling that something is going to happen. And if it does, I just hope I'm prepared for it. I'm trying not to let this consume me, but it's difficult when it feels like something's looming over me. It's like waiting for a storm to hit and you don't know how bad it's going to be when it'll arrive. I just wish I knew how to do it or how to stop it from happening. But for now, all I can do is wait and try to be ready for whatever comes my way. I've been having visions of the future for a while now, and for some reason, I always find myself coming back to share my story, for better or worse. My latest vision was quite an experience, but thankfully, someone in the comments really helped me out. I was on my way out to the city, and I'd rather not name when, but I got a flat tire, and luckily, a tire plug kit came in really handy, and I would have been screwed without it, honestly. This one might be a little bit longer than usual, as I want to try to hash out what these visions are and what they actually mean. Let me start by explaining one I had just 3 days ago. This one felt oddly ominous, for reasons that we'll get into later. Excuse any literacy or typos, as I can't say I'm the brightest cookie in the batch. It was around 8 a.m. on Monday, now sitting in my car getting ready to go to work for the day, when it happened. A strange twitching feeling set an odd shock through my body, unlike any other twitch or muscle or chill. It was quickly accompanied by a series of mental images through my head, vivid pictures of me in a forest at night, seeming to have mud on my hands while crouched down, and the last one was me and some other figure in a hoodie by a building. I'm not a printer, so I can't say how much more detail without these weird spikes of my imagination. One thing to note is that I'm an avid airsoft player and even spend some time playing sport. However, I've never played at night, although night games are a thing. Sometimes these flashes in general, though, are alarming. Each vision I get normally gives me a sense of panic, but this one feels odd to me. I want to chalk it up to maybe envisioning a game of airsoft at late night, but I can't shake the feeling that this may be more ominous than I'd like it to be. If anyone takes the time to read this or hear this, I hope you can try to help me make sense of it. Outside opinions really help, and I just wonder why all of a sudden these things become more ominous than they've been for the past year or so, before the couple of bad ones. It's almost as if something's trying to warn me or tell me something, but I just can't quite figure out what it is. Maybe it's just my imagination running wild, or maybe it's something more. All I know is that these visions have become a part of my life, for better or worse. Does anyone remember this story? It's been 9 years since I've heard this story, and I'm not very thrilled to be the storyteller, so bear with me. I also may not get all the details exactly right. I honestly don't even know if the story actually existed and it was just a bunch of made-up stuff from kids I went to school with, but a lot of my classmates used to recite this story an awful lot, so I figure it may come for the internet from me. All I know is that it used to creep me out. Keep in mind, here's a few alternate versions of the story too, but I'm not going to go into those, so I'm going to stick to just this one. So anyway, it went something along the lines of this. There's this family, a mother, father, and daughter. The daughter's name was Sally, I think. I don't think the parents were named originally for the sake of the retelling. I'm going to call them Mary and John. I can't for the life of me remember accurately. I don't know the reason why, but there comes a point where Mary and John decide to get rid of their daughter. I may be wrong, but I believe it could have been because of her bad behavior issues or something like that. So anyway, by get rid of, I mean they literally take Sally to a random location in the middle of nowhere and just leave her there. Again, I'm a little foggy on the details, but I'm pretty sure the parents decide to murder her and dump the body somewhere that won't really be found. A bit extreme, but to each their own, I suppose. So once the body's dealt with, John and Mary return home and go to bed. Fast forward a couple of weeks and the parents are in bed trying to sleep when John's awoken by the faint sound of a voice. Concerned and scared, he gets up to go check it out. He searches the house but finds nothing and assumes it's just a dream. The following night, the same thing occurs, but this time, the voice is heard by both parents. John explains his experiences from the night prior, and both him and his wife become increasingly worried that maybe someone might be in the house. Both sit quietly for a moment until they hear the voice again. They begin to realize that the voice is repeating itself every few seconds, and they can't seem to make out what it's saying as it's too quiet. Suddenly the voice stops. John hesitantly scouts the house once again, finds nothing. The next night, Mary's unable to sleep due to her paranoia about what had happened previously. In an attempt to ease her mind, she checks that all the doors and windows in the house are locked. After getting back into bed hoping to fall asleep, she suddenly hears the voices again. Terrified, she quickly wakes her husband, and like before, the voice seemed to repeat itself at an interval of a few seconds, though this time it's different. This time the voices become slightly louder and clearer. John and Mary are petrified when they recognize the voice as none other than Sally's. They sit in fear as Sally's voice softly and repeatedly chants the word, "Sally is 70 miles away." After speaking these lines for several minutes, the voice stops once again. John and Mary consider calling the police, but ultimately come to the conclusion that this would be a risk that they'd get caught. From that night onward, John and Mary would try their best to ignore the horrifying voice of what seemed to be their own daughter chanting each night. Since the police were not an option, there's really nothing they could do but hope that some kind of prank or something was happening. They really didn't know what to believe. There was no way that this could be possible. Hearing their own deceased daughter's voice, they had noticed that a family with seemingly troublesome children had moved in next door, not long after Sally's death. Mary had witnessed these kids messing around with other people's property before, like damaging mailboxes and such. But with this in mind, Mary and John hoped that they were just getting messed with. However, at the same time, the chanting continued, and things only got more unsettling. Each night the voice would get louder and seem to get closer, and they would say the same thing, but with one small difference each time. It would claim to be closer each night. When the voice first became audible to John and Mary, it spoke the words, "Sally is 70 miles away," and the night after that, "Sally is 60 miles away," and then 50, 40, 30, and so on. By this point, both parents would refuse to sleep, staying up all night scared and disturbed as to what they were hearing, until one night it stopped. Finally, after a week of listening in horror and being deprived of sleep, Mary and John were able to get some. Things returned to normal, and through their experience that left them terrified. The couple tried their best to forget both what had happened and what had been done to their daughter. They moved on and they were living their lives normally. This was until one night after several weeks they heard the voice again, and this time it was loudest and the closest it had ever been. John and Mary were in complete disbelief as to what they were hearing. Mary on the verge of tears yelling out for the voice to stop while John sat silent, too scared to talk. Again, The voice would say its chant, but this time it was different. This time it began with, "Sally is at your front door." A few moments later, the voice would speak again and say, "Sally is in the kitchen." But this time, John and Mary were the most scared they had ever been in their lives, with the covers pulled up to their mouths as they sat, unable to move, looking straight ahead, waiting and hoping it would go away. After almost a minute of waiting, the voice spoke again, "Sally is at your bedroom door." A few weeks later, the parents were found dead in their bed, covered in blood. Demonic knocks. I never thought I'd experience anything like this before. I was always a skeptic when it came to the paranormal, but everything changed that one fateful night. I was sitting in my living room, staring intently at my computer screen when I heard a series of knocks on my front door. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then it happened again and again. The knocking grew louder and more forceful with each repetition, until it turned into a deafening pounding that shook my entire house. I was terrified, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. I knew I shouldn't answer the door, but the pounding was so persistent that I felt like I had no other choice. I cautiously made my way to the door, heart pounding in my chest, and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, no one was there, just an empty porch, bathed in an eerie light of the moon. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued and so on, till I realized that it wasn't coming from the wooden door at all. It was coming from my glass sliding door, the one that led to my backyard. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually mustered up the courage to take the look. As I approached the door, I could feel a chill run down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I peered through the glass, and that's when I saw it. It was a figure shrouded in darkness. It had black hair that cascaded down its body, and arms that stretched all the way to its knees. I couldn't see its face, but I could hear it mumbling something under its breath. The figure was so tall that it obscured the porch light with its head. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak, and then suddenly the figure took off running, racing around my house with lightning speed. I could hear its footsteps pounding against the ground, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it eventually disappeared completely. The next morning I went outside to investigate, and that's when I saw it. A trail of water on my porch, leading to a chair that was sitting on the other side of a glass door. The chair looked like it had been sat in, and there was a damp spot where the figure had been. I took pictures of everything determined to document the strange occurrence. But even as I sat inside my house, safe and sound, I could hear the figure outside, still mumbling incoherently as it ran around my property. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I knew that it was something beyond my understanding, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to make it go away. Experience while sleeping in my dead great-grandmother's room. I remember the night like it was yesterday. I was staying with my grandparents and aunt in Bryan, Texas when I was 12 years old. My dad was with us the first night, but he had to head off to do some work and left me with my grandparents for the remainder of the stay. I was staying in the room where my grandparents were caring for my since-departed great-grandmother, since it was the only free room in the house. The couple nights leading up into the incident, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Then on the third night, things took a turn. I went to bed like usual and everything was fine. I always left the door cracked, so it was also cracked on this specific night. The first thing I remember that startled me was the old rotary phone that makes noises out of nowhere. I don't know exactly how they work, but it made a really, really long continuous beeping noise, like beep, for what felt like 2 or 3 minutes before it stopped. It kind of freaked me out, but I didn't really think much of it. It eventually stopped on its own, which made me feel better. But the thing that really scared me was shortly after the beep stopped. I noticed a shadow outside the cracked door, which appeared to be someone walking by, which didn't startle me at first, but as it went by, the door slammed really hard. My scared 12-year-old self instantly pulled the blankets over my head, and I was scared, but eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up and saw my aunt, and she seemed terrified. I asked her what was wrong, and she asked if I was walking around last night. I said no. She seemed really scared, so I asked why she asked. She said she was awake in bed last night and heard something making noise. She said that she stared at the door and it opened and a tall black figure made its way into her room. Her bed was positioned so that there was a small gap between the bed and the wall, and she told me she saw the figure and got scared and basically rolled herself in her blanket into the gap between her bed and the wall and stayed there all night out of fear. This all freaked me out quite a bit. We both thought it was maybe her dad walking around at night. We also forgot to mention until now that the house also had a home security system that made a very loud beep every time a door or window was opened. So neither of us thought that it could be a home invasion or anything like that. Then, not 5 minutes later, both her parents woke up and came out of their room and asked if they were walking around last night because they heard lots of noises too. Neither me nor their aunt really said anything about it to each other since, but I think we both came to the same realization. Looking back, it's hard to believe that we were all just brushing it off like it was nothing. It was as if we were all in denial, trying to rationalize the noises and the shadow as something other than what it really was, but deep down, I knew that it wasn't normal. I had never experienced anything like it before, and I hope I never will again. As we packed up to leave my grandparents' house, there was a feeling of unease that lingered in the air. We all tried to shake it off, but it was hard to ignore the strange events of the past few nights. I didn't bring it up to my dad as I didn't want to scare him, but I couldn't help but feel that something was off. Until this day, I still wonder what really happened that night. And if we were all in the living room, we started to hear the noise and footsteps upstairs. It was clear and distinct, like someone was walking around up there. We all froze and looked at each other in disbelief. We knew that we were the only ones in the house. We couldn't deny that we were hearing it. We sat in silence listening to the footsteps for what felt like an eternity. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Finally, my aunt got up and said she's going to go check it. We tried to stop her, but she was determined to find out what was going on. As she climbed the stairs, the footsteps got louder and faster. It was like the person was running back and forth. We heard my aunt scream and we all ran upstairs to see what was happening. When we got to the top, my aunt was standing in the hallway, shaking and crying. She said she saw the figure at the end of the hallway, but it disappeared when she got closer. We didn't see anything, but we could feel the presence of something there. We were all scared out of our minds and didn't know what to do. We ended up calling a local paranormal investigator to come check out the house. They did an investigation and found that the house was indeed haunted. They picked up EVPs and had strange experiences while they were there. They told us that the entity in the house wasn't harmful, but it was still unsettling to know that we were sharing a house with a ghost. After the experience, we never really stayed at my aunt's house again. We were all too scared to go back. Until this day, we still talk about that night that changed our belief about the paranormal, and that's something you'll never forget. Interaction with my mom. In 2006, I lost my mother to a brain aneurysm. It was a devastating blow to me, as my dad was never really there for me and my mom was my whole world. A few months later, my dad decided to move into a new woman who didn't really like me and I didn't really like her. She wanted me to call her Mom, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She didn't like my friends or anything that I did. It made living at home a nightmare. To make matters worse, I started cutting myself when I was 13. My dad didn't find out until I spent my 17th birthday in a mental facility. When I got out, things were still terrible at home. The only bright spot was that I became involved with a woman's son who I found very attractive. She didn't know about our relationship, but I didn't care. In November, my dad and his girlfriend decided to kick me out of the house because I took some of his prescription pills and sold them at school. I withdraw from school because I get expelled, but it didn't matter. My dad chose his girlfriend over me, and it was heartbreaking. I ended up in a detention center, which is similar to a juvenile shelter. That's when the strange things started happening, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see my mom sitting on the nightstand. At first I was scared and confused. How could my mom be here? Was she still alive, even though I watched her take her last breath? But after a few nights, I started looking forward to see her. We would have long conversations till early morning, and it was like she was really there with me. I didn't tell anyone about it, and I was afraid that they would think I was crazy. Have any of you ever experienced anything like this? I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or my mom's spirit was really there, but either way, it brought me comfort during a very difficult time. Anybody know what this was? It was a few years ago, around 7 to be exact, when I experienced something that I still can't explain to this day. I was at home with my ex-boyfriend and 2 other friends. My ex was standing in the doorway, one friend was sitting on the floor near the doorway, and the other was sitting on the TV stand at the foot of the bed. I was on the bed facing the doorway, and we were all just hanging out and chatting. Suddenly I jumped, and I was startled by something that I saw behind my ex. It was weird looking and looked like a black wolf that smiled, almost as if it was half human, part animal. I told my ex what I saw, and he said that he felt like he was pushed too, because we both jumped at the same time. That experience stayed with me for years until 2018 when I was in California. I met a guy out there who I had a prior connection to. When I was at his place, I saw the same wolf-like thing on a mask on his wall. It was a shocking realization. I couldn't help but wonder what it was and why I kept seeing it. I've been trying to gather more information about this wolf-like creature, but so far, haven't found anything concrete. It's like it's a mystery that only a few people know about, and I'm left to wonder what it all means. All I know is that I never want to experience anything like that again, and I'll be sure to avoid any places or people that have anything to do with that creature. Back when I used to work in a half-shut-down hospital, I never experienced or encountered anything paranormal. The hospital had been closed for quite some time, but the company I worked for bought it as a satellite emergency room. However, due to lack of awareness about our services, the first few months were rather slow and uneventful. One of the doctors I worked with was into ghost hunting, and he often encouraged me to explore the old parts of the hospital during my night shifts. I wasn't really into the idea, but one night he gave me a radar and convinced me to go down to the back room. I didn't expect to find anything, but I went along anyway. As I was finishing up my exploration and preparing to go on a cigarette break, I heard a voice in the pitch darkness. It simply said, "Don't smoke." I froze in place and looked down at my unlit cigarette in my hand, unable to believe what I'd just heard and what had just happened. In that moment, I was completely spooked, and I immediately ran out of the room. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, and it lingered with me for days after the incident. It's worth noting that I quit smoking about 5 or 6 years ago now, and that experience may have played a role in that decision. Despite my skepticism about the paranormal, this experience definitely made me more open to the possibility that there may be more to this world than what we can see or understand. It's a memory that stayed with me for years. It's one that still gives me chills to this day. One of my many encounters. I remember this one encounter from 4 or 5 years ago that still gives me chills. It happened when my sister and I got home from playing volleyball, and I found that no one was home. We called our family and found out that we were at our cousin's house, and a few of our siblings would come back and pick us up. While we waited, my sister and I decided to hang out in my parents' room because she wanted to use the computer. We closed and locked the door for some reason, and I started playing games on my phone. And she was busy clicking away on the keyboard. It was completely silent except for the sound of the mouse and keyboard when we suddenly heard a loud bang on the front door, followed by footsteps running away from it. We were both terrified by the sudden noise and just stared at each other and the door. We thought that maybe our siblings had returned, and they were playing a prank on us. So we decided to check the whole house, every room and the garage. However, we found no one, and we immediately went back to my parents' room and locked the door again. We were shaken up by what had just happened and couldn't help but discuss the fact that we both heard footsteps running away from the door. We were lucky that our siblings arrived soon after. We quickly ran out to meet them and told them about everything that had happened. This encounter is the one that still stands out the most for me, and it still terrifies me to this day.